for over a year the need for a workshop to share information on listed seabirds in Hawaii. A lot of us work on individual projects related to seabirds, but don't really have a current understanding of all the different issues and actions that are affecting the birds throughout the state. So we really appreciate the participation of all the speakers today so that we can get a better overview of statewide concerns. There are going to be several short breaks throughout the program today, so don't worry about that. And if you have any issues or want to say something without interjecting, you can always type it into the chat. Koa is going to be monitoring that and running the meeting for us. I know with the format that we've usually used in meetings like this, it's relatively informal. And if people have questions throughout the presentations, they often just interrupt and ask those questions. That is usually fine with most speakers. So I would ask each speaker when you start your presentation to please let us know if you would like the audience to ask questions as an issue arises, or if you prefer them to wait until the end of your presentation. I think that is more or less all we have for the morning as far as introductions. We're going to get started with Dr. Andre Rain on the island of Kauai.
Good morning, everyone. Good to see so many familiar faces out there, or mainly black screens with people's faces on, names on them. But it's good to see those of you who I can see on the camera. Yes, as Kate said, you know, I'm certainly happy to be interrupted throughout my presentation. I do have a kind of hefty 2 hours here, so I have quite a lot of slides. But I'm more than happy to you know, have people interrupting to kind of if there's anything that piques your interest or you have questions on. So please feel free to interrupt at will. Let me see if I can get my screen up. Just one sec. Okay, can you guys see my screen? Yeah. Okay, great. All right, well, the purpose of my presentation is just to talk about the status of Kauai's endangered seabirds, the trends that they've faced, the threats, and the road to recovery. I'm sticking to Kauai, and I've tried to sort of skip through species biology, etc., because I'm assuming that everyone knows by this stage in the game what a Newell shearwater, Hawaiian Petrol, and banded rump storm petrel are. But there they are, just in case you were wondering. So on Kauai, we've got all three of the endangered seabirds. We have a sizable population of Hawaiian petrels, maybe about a third. We have most of the world's population of Newell shearwater, and then we have unknown size population of banded rump storm petrels. Hawaiian petrels and Newells are of course endemic to the Hawaiian Islands, and the banded rump storm petrel currently it has a more global distribution. But there has been recent genetic work to show that this species probably represents a series of cryptic species, and that the banded rump storm petrel that exists in the Hawaiian Islands is possibly a subspecies or even a species. So it's a really enigmatic and interesting little species, and I'll talk about that one later on in my presentation. On Kauai, the seabirds are predominantly found now in really remote parts of the island, the northwest of the island. Those upper two slides are typical habitat of Hawaiian petrel and Newell shearwater. So it's characterized by native forest, steep ridges, and drainages. And in the bottom left-hand side, which is the Waimea Canyon, is also a breeding habitat for Newell shearwater, but also for the banded rump storm petrel, which likes these more sort of drier, craggy, cliffy areas. And the bottom right-hand side is just to illustrate that most of these sites are extremely remote and are accessible by helicopter only. So very few of our sites can we actually hike into, which presents its own logistical entertainment and does mean that accessing these sites is more expensive than just having a little trot up into the mountains. So the vast majority of my my talk will be focused on these two, the Newell shearwater and the Hawaiian petrel, because these are the ones that we have the most information on. For those of you who know me, I've spent many years frantically trying to find a banded rump storm petrel nest and have been thwarted throughout. So I'll deal with those guys at the end. And I'm sure Rogelio, for example, will have a lot more to talk about in terms of actual existing storm petrel burrows, which is awesome. So yes, the focus of the beginning, the majority of this talk is going to be on these two species. So we'll start with trends. Newell shearwater and Hawaiian petrel, they have not done well on Kauai in recent years, in recent decades. There's been a long-running radar monitoring program for these two species. Started in 1993 and has continued through pretty much until last year and hopefully into the future as well. And we have, there have been radar sites across the island, which kind of basically span all of the flyways into the interior of the island, except for areas which are not accessible by road. And the gray circles show passage rate for both species in 1993, and in the black is in the last year, which was 2000 actually. And you can see, the take-home message there is massive decline. Very few targets passing through many of these areas now compared to what they would have been like decades ago. And all this trend analysis is available in the Condor in that paper if you haven't seen it already. And between 1993 and 2013, which is the period covered by this work, the Newells had a 94% population decline, and a Hawaiian Petrol underwent a 78% population decline. So they both really sort of plummeting in terms of populations over this time period. And that's not really surprising when you think about all of the threats that these birds face. And I'll be spending a lot of time in this presentation talking about those threats. But they've had it really hard. And the time when these species darkened the skies of Kauai as they flew in huge numbers is gone. Lots of these areas now, especially in the east and the south, where there would have been large populations in the past. And I mean, that's, when we talk about the past, it's only like the 80s and 90s. Those colonies are, in many cases, down to a handful of birds left. And so a lot of these colonies are basically, unfortunately, becoming extirpated. And, because it costs a lot of money and time and effort to protect these birds, I think we have to face the facts that we just have to let some of these colonies go, which is really a sad thing to say, but we got to concentrate on the areas where the birds are actually still doing relatively well. And that radar data, that decline that was shown in the radar data is also mirrored by a decline shown in the Save Our Shearwaters fledglings. So these are all, the Save Our Shearwaters is a rescue program run by the state of Hawaii in currently in the Kauai Humane Society. And it's probably the longest running seabird rescue program in the world. And I don't need to tell you guys more about it because I'm sure everyone knows about Save Our Shearwaters. But just to say that if you look at the numbers of fledglings that were being retrieved by, handed in by the general public in the 1980s, those were, on average around 1,500 birds. And now basically you don't crest 200 in a season. So this huge decline that was shown in the radar with the radar targets is equally mirrored in the on the flip side of the coin, which is the fledglings as they're leaving their colonies. So it's a very real decline over time. Interestingly enough, there is, if you look at the sites where there's less information, so there were two sites on the northwest of the island, Wainiha and Lumahai, which are actually large valleys where there are sizable populations of Newells or Hawaiian petrels, depending on which of the two valleys you're talking about. Those two sites didn't start, there were no radar surveys there until 2006 onwards. So it's a much shorter period of time. And during that period of time, the radar, the targets and passage rates of birds passing into those areas hasn't really changed. So in that part of the island, over that period of time, there has been no massive decline. And if you then have a look at the last decade of the radar work, you can see that there's no decline over that period of time either. It's sort of flatlined out. And this is also mirrored again by the Save Our Shearwaters fledglings. The only sort of fluctuations that we've seen in the last decade with the fledglings that are falling out is related to moon illumination. You know, if it's a period of time when there's a full moon and that coincides with the peak of the Newell shearwater fledgling period, then there's less fallout. So what this suggests to me, at least, is that we've seen this huge, massive, large-scale decline in between 1993 and 2013, and that's kind of petered out at a sort of flat line over the last 10 years or so. And I wouldn't say that's a good thing. You know, what it suggests to me is that we've seen, you know, the large numbers of birds that were going to be vulnerable to some of the major threats, which we'll be talking about in a bit. Those birds are all gone now. And so you're left with a sort of residual populations in many of these areas that are just managing to cling on. But it is interesting.
Andre, I got a question.
Hey, Kavika.
Hi, so I just to make sure I'm following you, the previous graphs were 93 to 2013. This one's 2010 to 2020. I'm sorry, did I miss something about the switch in time periods?
Yeah, it's just to say that, you know, if you look at it from a long time, you know, if you look at 93 to 2020, for example, then you're going to see this decline. But if you plot it over time, it's leveling out in the last decade. And that's mirrored by these guys here, where we only have that data from 2006 to 2020.
Yeah, and this is the radar data, right?
Yes.
Okay, and that truck didn't go all the way to Limahuli. That's why you don't have Limahuli on there, right?
Yeah, correct. Limahuli is the way that we've been monitoring, the way that trends are being monitored in that area is through things like saw meters and burrow monitoring.
Thank you.
Yep. So yeah, you know, I feel like with the trends, the take-home message is massive decline for the 93 to 2013, then a leveling out, but it's an indication of birds sort of petering along at a very low level in all these areas now, just the ones that have managed to cling on to existence.
Andre, one quick question here, and maybe you'll get to this. So if you're going to answer this question later, then just say, okay, we'll get to that. But just curious, the leveling out and flat lines, I know in other long-lived species that I've worked on, you see that trend, but it's basically because you're getting very low recruitment, but these are long-lived species, and so you're just seeing the persistence of a handful of adults. Do you feel like this is, based on what you're seeing, is it that we're kind of leveling out where recruitment is equaling mortality? Or is it that kind of thing where you just have, you know, a long-lived adults kind of giving the appearance of a stable population?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the answer is, well, that's a kind of wait and see. You know, if it's the long-lived hypothesis, then suddenly there's going to be a drop off in maybe another 20 years where the last of those birds just peter out, and then you're going to get zero. But I feel it's more like, if you look at the areas where the birds that are using these flyways, where the radar is, the sites where the radar is monitoring, the birds that are left in those areas are on really steep cliff walls where they're less susceptible to predation. And in areas where things like power lines they're perhaps more likely to fly over the power lines rather than through them. Or they're in areas where light attraction is becoming less of an issue. So I would like to take perhaps a more positive note in a bleak situation, in that these are residual populations that are clinging on to existence. But yes, you could certainly also suggest that this is there are long-lived species, you know, 35 years is kind of what one would expect a Newell's to make it to if it's lucky, and that you could suddenly see them tank out too.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that's trends. Like I said, kind of bleak, but they are endangered seabirds, and they've been having a lot of trouble for many decades. And we'll talk about that coming up. You know, what those threats are and how we can deal with them, and hopefully reverse those trends. So the next thing is to understand where these birds are. And you can do that two ways. The first is by modeling breeding distribution. There are two papers, one using habitat suitability models, both for Hawaiian petrels and Newell's shearwaters. And those were, the habitat suitability models were based on data from burrows, known burrows, and areas where the birds were known to persist. And this is the kind of picture that you get. So Hawaiian Petrol on the right-hand side, Newell's on the left. And you can see that the Newell's has perhaps a broader breeding distribution that's related more to cliffs, for example, like the Newell's can be found on the Napali cliffs. They are capable of nesting in dry, cliffy areas on Kauai, whereas on Kauai, at least, the birds, the Hawaiian Petrols are restricted to these sort of wet montane forests, which I think in and of itself is interesting because that's obviously not what they're restricted to on some of the other islands. So you can see here that these birds are capable of breeding in large areas across the islands. It's really good to have a handle on what those kind of areas might look like to help identify where these birds actually are and then work on protecting them in those areas. But of course, as those last few slides have highlighted, the birds have gone through a massive decline. And so although these are the habitats where the birds might be found, they're certainly not found in that kind of distribution anymore. And so the next step after modeling breeding distribution has been to actually map breeding distribution. And that involves going to areas, the focus has been to go to areas where birds habitat looks good for them or where they've been known to breed in the past, and then conducting nocturnal auditory surveys. And those surveys are carried out for 2 hours after dark and 2 hours before dawn on Kauai. Which is the time period when the birds are passing to and from the colonies, particularly the Newell shearwater. The Newells are very focused on those 2 periods of time, whereas the Hawaiian Petrol is more capable of arriving and departing at any time during the night. But you still get sort of a peak movement of those birds during that time period. And so by carrying out surveys during that time, during the peak of the breeding season, you can sort of map and figure out where those birds are within the areas where they're likely to breed. And there have been a lot of surveys in the last decade. This is the survey distribution of the island. Broadly speaking, the surveys have concentrated on areas where the birds are most likely to be, but there have been some private land restrictions. Some areas are not accessible because of private land restrictions. But it's a pretty good, considering the size of the island and the size of available habitat, auditory survey distribution has covered, I would say, a significant proportion of the best breeding habitat left on Kauai. So you can see, I don't know if, can you guys see my pointer? Yeah, cool. All right, yeah, so mainly, broadly speaking, you've got the Nepalis pretty well covered. And then the whole area for Hana Napali, the edges of the Kalalau, Limahuli, and Upper Minoa. And then Wainiha, Lumahai, and Hanalei Valley are the other main bastions of seabird activity, and that's also shown by radar. And then you've got the Waimea Canyon here, and then these sort of dying colonies down here, which are places like Kalaheo and Kahili, and Haupu and Kuluahonu have also been well surveyed, as well as Wailua, Anahola. And these ones here, particularly, I would say Kalaheo Kahili colony is a good example of how bad things can get. This colony here in the 80s was as big a Newell's shearwater colony as Upper Limahuli, if you look at the numbers of birds that were being monitored with burrow monitoring and surveys and so on. And now, I haven't been up there for a couple of years, but last time I was up there, I mean, we're estimating something under a dozen birds left. And the markers that we use to mark the burrows there are basically like grave markers. You go to each of those old burrows and they're just long since been, the birds are long since gone, unfortunately. So this is the areas where surveys have been undertaken over time. And this is the kind of distribution that we've got from those surveys. So you can see really, when you look at it, that's kind of the area where these birds are predominantly now. And that's the area where most management work is being focused or should be focused, is these large colonies, large being a relative term, of course, compared to what they would have been, but these remnant colonies that exist in these areas compared to if you look down here, you've just got these little patchy blobs here and there. And then Kilauea Point's its own story, which I'll get to in a bit.
So Andre, what is the color code?
Okay, yeah. Sorry. Blue is mules and red is Hawaiian Petrol. And so you can see, for example, along the Nepali coast, there's no red because the Hawaiian Petrols don't breed on those cliff faces. But then you can see in Hana Nepali Natural Area Reserve, you've got this big concentration of red. And then in some of the backs of some of these valleys, Wainiha, Lumahai, you have, especially in Lumahai, a nice pocket of Hawaiian Petrol activity too. It's interesting in that, and I'll get to it in a bit, but the number of burrows that are being monitored at the moment is it's mainly Hawaiian Petrols, and that's compared to mules. And I would say that's because, it's basically impossible to get to these concentrations of birds on these multi-thousand-foot cliffs on the Nepali coast. You basically find yourself in a small crumpled heap at the bottom of the cliffs if you try to access them. Nobody wants that. So the Hawaiian Petrols, although their distribution may be smaller, they're in more accessible areas and they've been easier in inverted commas to find. So we've gone through trends and distribution. So now we'll talk about how colony monitoring has occurred in management sites. And there's a cute little Newell shearwater chick to make everyone feel happy for the morning. And this is classic habitat for Newells and Hawaiian Petrols, and there's a song meter. So currently there are 7 colonies where seabird management is taking place. It's been great to see this. In 2011, there was no intensive management in any site. Now there are 7 sites where there's active seabird management, so that's really a positive thing. And you can see from this map, we've got North Bog, Hanakapiai, Hanakoa, Pihea, and Poakea. These are all in Hana Nepali Natural Area Reserve. And then Upper Limahuli, which is owned by NTBG and managed by NTBG. And then, sorry, I don't know why I still don't have a map which has Upper Minoa's boundary in it, but I did put a little yellow star to indicate it. This is Upper Minoa, which is a private property where the landowner has really graciously allowed seabird management to take place. So these are the areas where we've got long-term management in place currently. And, they are remote areas. Over time, trail systems have been developed. Some of them have weather ports, but they are remote. They're difficult to get to. The weather is not always pleasant. I mean, I often wonder whether I should put photos up like this because these are like the one day out of the year when you can actually see the, the weather port here, for example. Maybe I should just put photos of gray, rain, and so on to make it more like a normal day. But they're really remote areas, and this is probably why the birds are still clinging on to these areas. And here's some nice dense aluhe where you might find a Newell shearwater burrow. And here's 5 of the sites just arrayed against each other. So blue on the left is Newell shearwater distribution, and red on the right is Hawaiian Petrol. And I would say the take-home message from the slide is just that each site's firstly very different in terms of its composition of species, of the 2 species. And so each one has its own importance based on species. So if you look at like Limahuli, for example, this really is one of the main jewels for a Newell shearwater. It's, although there's been now a decade of work to try to find other places like Limahuli, the closest that has been found is Upper Minoa next to it. And this is because this area, the birds, the Newell shearwaters here are at least somewhat accessible. They're on steep ridges and deep drainages, and they're really hard to get to, but at least you can find them. Whereas in these other areas, they're much, much harder to find. Then you get somewhere like, and conversely, neither of those 2 areas have much in the way of Hawaiian Petrols. Upper Limahuli has Hawaiian Petrols in its sort of southern edge, or the upper part of the preserve. There's basically no Hawaiian Petrol activity at all in Upper Minoa. And then you get this sort of split here, which is Poakea, which you can see on the map there is number 3. So there's Minoa and Limahuli, and then Poakea. And here it's basically like half is Newells and then half is Hawaiian Petrol. And then when you get down to the lower parts of Hononapali, you basically got pretty much no mule shearwater activity or limited mule shearwater activity in certain parts of the site, but it's lots of Hawaiian petrels. And it'd be nice if both species were equally found across all sites, but it's just not the way it is. And so these are the other two sites, Hanakapia and Hanako, which are in here in the middle parts of Hononapali. They're also Hawaiian petrel heavy sites. And that's the number of burrows which are currently being monitored for both species. So there's 281 mule shearwater burrows and 917 Hawaiian petrel burrows across the 7 sites. And those burrows are monitored 10 times a year or 8 to 10 times a year to look at how the birds are faring each year in terms of reproductive success. So there's a good amount of burrow monitoring on an annual basis for both species on Kauai, which is great because each site you can then plot the changing fates of the birds related to management actions. And within each of those sites, there's also a subset that are monitored by cameras. So there are 30 in each site that are monitored by cameras. And the cameras are, it's 30, but each month you end up having to take some of them out because the conditions in these sites are not kind to electronics. I've actually been really impressed with some of these. They've actually managed to last in that appalling environment for electronics. We've got some which have been running for almost a decade. So hats off to those. But it's not always the case, and a lot of them die within a couple of years. And the cameras are really important, whereas the burrow monitoring is the way that we get the way that one gets reproductive success rate changes over time. The burrows give you that. The burrow cameras give you that in-depth information, both in terms of predators, like this cat that's emerging with a mule shearwater in its mouth at a site in Hononapali. You get a lot of information on predator interactions, as well as the birds themselves. Here's a mule shearwater about to fledge. And so you can get a lot of information on the bird's phenology. And this slide's basically saying what I just said. So you've got on the left, this is a number of monitored burrows with activity each day. You can get this nice map of breeding phenology of the birds and how they interact over time at the sites, the colonies, which is really important information for understanding things like Powerline collisions. If you know when a bird is, when each of the 2 species are at the site, then you can get a better handle on the split in terms of number of birds passing over power lines. And then this is cat visits on camera at one of the sites over time, showing, broadly speaking, that in this case, looks like management's working, that instead of having the 19 visits that were in this year, now we're down to about 4. So these are really important important equipment for management in particular. And at 30 cameras, 7 sites, that's 210 cameras, collecting anywhere from 1,000 to 25,000 images a month, equates to a significant amount of time scanning these cameras for predators or garnering data for whatever it is that the cameras are being used for in any given year. So that's, I would just say, in terms of thinking about logistics, cameras are really awesome tools, but as everyone who uses cameras knows, it's great to be collecting the data, but then some poor soul has to go through it and have a look at it all. So the burrow monitoring and the cameras is really key for getting that information at a burrow level, but you're only monitoring burrows that are accessible or that you found. And of course, the burrows that are being monitored are a fraction of the burrows that are that exist within a site. So that's where saw meters come in. Saw meters measure call rates over time, and we've looked the relationship between call rates and breeding birds has been investigated, and there's a strong, significant relationship between the two. So you can say that call rates are related to the number of breeding birds within an area. And the aim with these saw meters has been to put space them about 250 meters apart and try to get an oral net of saw meters over the each entire management site, so that each area is being monitored almost totally by saw meters at this stage as well. And that information is really key for multiple things, as well as looking at reproductive success rates in burrows. You can then look at call rate change over time to see if there's a change in calls and thus breeding birds at each site. And it's been really noticeable across all the sites as management has ramped up that call rates have increased almost, in many cases, almost annually for both species, mules and Hawaiian petrels, which taken with increase in reproductive success rate show that management's working. You know, if you remove predators, then invasive introduced predators, and do other seabird related management, you're going to see those birds reacting in a positive way.
Andre,
Yep.
can you go back to that slide for just a second?
Mhm.
Is that one image on the left altered with a Sharpie or something? What is that? Is that
And which one?
the one on the left, the image?
This one?
Yeah, it looks like it looks weird. What is that?
This is a pair of Newell shearwaters. I did put a fancy shadow on it to make it pop out on the screen, but maybe it's just made it look weird.
Okay, all right. Yeah, it just looked like it had been Sharpied. Anyway.
No, that's one Newell shearwater and the second Newell shearwater inside their burrow. And yeah, that's a little bit of a shadow around it, I guess. Yeah.
Hey, Andre, this is Rogelio. I had a question for you. You know, at the beginning, when I was trying to look at my study, I know the literature really talked about non-breeders being the primary callers. How do you take that into consideration as far as reproductive success if the primary callers are non-breeders?
Yeah, that's a great question, and actually something we're trying to work on with CMI right now. Conservation Metrics, who are the ones who actually process all the data for people who don't know who CMI is. And one of the interesting things that we've been looking at is getting cameras, ultrafire cameras on active burrows to see whether adults do vocalize, because those ultrafires take high def videos with sound. And we don't have many of them, or there aren't many of them, but the striking thing is that adults do definitely vocalize, but not a lot. And it seems that vocalization with them is mainly a territorial thing. So if another Newell comes trundling over and sticks its beak in an active burrow, you're going to get some pretty vigorous calling back to send it packing. So I think there may be some, particularly with the Newell shearwater, some relationship between adults and subadults in terms of calling with the AM and PM periods, because that species, you get a lot of calling in the morning and some calling in the evening, whereas Hawaiian petrels and storm petrels only call in the morning, in the evening. And it's possible that the calling in AM and PM for the Newells may be one period maybe adults and one period maybe subadults. There's maybe a way of teasing that out. That's kind of what we're looking at right now. But I think broadly speaking, a lot of that calling is subadults and prospectors. And so therefore, I think the relationship, if that is the case, if it's strictly subadults, the relationship would be, if you think about it, subadults are attracted to other activity. That's the whole point of social attraction. And so if there's a lot of breeding activity going on in an area, then you're going to get a lot of subadults in the air above it, prospecting and pairing up and then attempting to breed. And so if you have, conversely, if there are hardly any birds left in a site, then there's very little activity. And also those subadults have probably slowly been weeded out by predators and power lines and light and so on and so forth. And so there's less activity in the air above the site. So even if the vast majority of that calling is subadults, it would still be related to number of breeding pairs simply because they're there because there's a lot of breeding pairs, if that makes sense.
Okay, and then I had a follow-up question. On the previous slide, you had the picture of the song meter. What was that brown? Is that like a roof cover to protect the microphones?
Yep. So that's sort of a product of many years of adaptation, the evolution of the song meter setup on Kauai. I should actually maybe create a slideshow of those things. The early years, they were unprotected, and we looked at different orientations of mics, up, down, side to side, 1, 2. And because it's raining so much there, either heavy rain or dense mist, data was being lost at a major rate. So in some of these sites, we were losing like up to 80%, 85% of data in some months. And so this is now the setup that's used on Kauai. And the idea is to have a rain shield over the top to protect the mics from the heaviest downpours. And then they also get sprayed lightly with Scotchgard, the microphones do, to allow the moisture to wick off the mics. Because once those mics get sodden, obviously, then they don't pick anything up. And so, yeah, that's the sort of setup that's now been adopted on Kauai for the last 5 years or so. And the change in data loss has been dramatic. Like it's gone from, like I said, some sites 85% down to like 5% or so.
Thank you.
Yeah, Andre, can you hear me?
Yep.
I saw you had a green one of those on a tree in one of your slides earlier too. But that's good to know. Yeah, like that one. We're not doing that over here. You think we don't get maybe the downpour in Kohala, but the constant mist. So just being moist is reducing the song meter ability to hear things.
Yeah, and CMI do take that into account when they analyze. They look at like quality of sound. They do have various ways of identifying that, and that's actually how we knew it was such a big issue on Kauai. But I would recommend definitely putting a rain shield over the top and then just spraying them lightly with a Scotchgard. You got to be careful with the spraying them because you can clog the pores of the microphone wind guards. So you got to do a light spray, but even that light spray helps to just wick some of that moisture off, particularly in misty areas. So I recommend both of those techniques for just reducing data loss, particularly in really wet environments.
Good to know. Yeah, CMI has never mentioned any of this to us, at least. Maybe they're getting good enough data, but
yeah, you should maybe
see what you're doing over there.
Yeah, you could ask Matthew and Jeff what percentage you're losing. It's become less of an issue from an analysis point of view now because they're using a Bayesian model for the two species, and so if you lose X% of data over time, you can still model it out. But better to get more data than less, right? This picture here does show a different way that that these sound meters are being mounted in some of the areas, particularly in dense aluhe, to try to bring it up on a tree to get it out of that, potentially sound muffling ground cover. And so in those cases, they're mounted, say, just above this is probably about 3 or 4 feet up.
Cool.
Okay. And the other really useful thing with the saw meters is just looking at kind of like using it as another way of looking at distribution of the species across areas and management sites. Obviously, it's kind of an obvious thing, but I just thought these two maps are kind of cool to look at in terms of thinking about the species differences. So these are Newell shearwater call rates. And the thing that obviously really pops out here is Limahuli and Minoa heaving with Newell shearwater. Hanakapiai in this deep drainage, Poakea on the top here, and then Pehea on the very edge of the Kalalau Rim. Whereas if you look at the Hawaiian Petrols, it's entirely the reverse, right? You've got Hawaiian Petrols in the interior, and then as you enter into these Newell strongholds, there's very little in the way of Hawaiian Petrol calling activity. So I think those two maps kind of, to me at least, nicely encapsulate the species distribution in these management areas. You can really look at it and visualize, like, within each site, what it is that you're protecting.
Hey, Andre, so there's that middle area between North Bog, Pihea, and Hanakoa that you guys aren't monitoring. Is it safe to assume those red dots would be in there as well if you were?
In here?
Yes.
Yeah, and these are also, yeah, certainly Hawaiian Petrols. And in the past, we did drop via helicopter saw meters across this entire area, basically this whole area here. And they were dropped at a spacing of 250 meters and then recovered using a grappling hook. And it shows entirely that the interior is all a Hawaiian Petrol area, like this is all Hawaiian Petrols. And then as you get to these areas out here, you start getting that that fringe of Newell shearwater calling. Actually, I have a pretty cool heat map of the whole of Hononapali Natural Air Reserve now using that data.
So Andre, this is Fern. I have a quick question. Do you think there's actual active exclusion by one species of the other, like between specific sites where the Hawaiian Petrol is versus the A'o? Because on West Maui, it seems like that's a possibility for the way that they use the exclosures.
I would say probably not. And the reason why is because these sites have been monitored for a long time with, you know, hundreds of cameras on burrows over that time period. The interactions between the two species have been really, really limited. And normally what they are is you'll get a Newell's burrow and a Hawaiian Petrel just sort of like ambling past and disappearing into darkness. Or conversely, a Hawaiian Petrel burrow with a Newell's ambling by, and never ever see any sort of fighting between the two of them. There have been a couple of burrows where they started out as Newell's and ended up as Hawaiian Petrels, or vice versa. And those typically have been in these areas like Poakea, where the species are, or this part of Upper Limahuli where the species are together. But I think really it's a microhabitat thing. And if you look at the Newell's, they really like these extremely steep areas because they're kind of pudgy birds with short wings that need, you know, lift off to take off. And the Hawaiian Petrels are more on the tops of the ridges, where they also use the drops to take off from, but you'll find them on the tops of ridge lines with slopes on either side. So I think it's a microhabitat thing rather than an interspecific competition.
Andre, just a dumb question from a person who's not a seabird expert. Are there other seabirds that nest in these same areas that we're just not tracking because they're not the two that are endangered? Or are these the only seabirds that are left using these spaces?
Yeah, these areas, it's only the two endangers, and then occasionally you get storm petrels. So the storm petrel, I'll get to those guys at the end, but they are, you know, they're not found in these areas here. But you do get storm petrel pockets on the edges here, which is also where you'll get Newell's. So that's the third seabird species. Apart from that, there's nothing. There's no other seabirds up there.
And is that just because in the case of the storm petrels, is that just because they're more sensitive to the things that are impacting them, or do they prefer the cliffside areas?
At least now, you know, we're looking at, if you think about it now in terms of current distribution, all the information is that they like those sheer cliff faces or dry areas on Kauai. That's where they're found. And the only pockets out of storm petrel activity that are outside of those areas are cliff faces that are within the vegetated valley, heavily vegetated valleys of Wainiha, Lumahai, and Hanalei. And they're just tiny little pockets. And when you find that activity, it's always an exposed cliff face. So yeah, I think it's you know, that's what they like. They don't like the dense forest.
Okay, yeah, and that makes sense. So on the Big Island where they're nesting, it's not a cliff face, but it is a much drier area. So that makes sense. Historically, would there have been any other species in these areas, or is it just it's just those two, even historically?
I think even historically it would have been just these two species. There were what, one or two extinct seabird species, but I believe those were coastal from the fossil record.
Thank you. Okay, I was just curious. I know it seems like an unrelated question, but I was just curious whether it was even possible to be picking up other things on these song meters, or whether these are the only ones you would even expect in this area. So thank you so much for your answer. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and you know, the song meters are only analyzed for Hawaiian Petrel and Newell's, so if there was anything else out there, they wouldn't even be looked for. But there's been a lot of auditory surveys in these areas, and a lot of time spent at night in these areas, and there's nothing else. At least from a seabird perspective. Some of them, you know, there's some forest birds, pueo, of course, but yeah, that's it for seabirds.
Andre, I have a related question about sympatric occupation. So there's that fence that they're doing over on the other side of the Kalalau Rim. I think it's a mitigation fence. Would you expect sympatric occupation of that plot?
I believe Lindsay will be talking about that next, but the idea there and all the upcoming fence sites is to do social attraction, depending on the site for what species. But the hope would be that you'd be able to get Hawaiian petrels and mules in the same fenced area, just like in Nahoku as well. And again, then those are going to be the areas where we'll really be able to see whether one species excludes another. The mules, like from personal hand experience, the mules have a gentle nibble, whereas the Hawaiian petrel will gouge the hell out of the top of your hand. So if my money was on one or the other, I think I'd go Hawaiian petrel. I've actually been chased out of burrows by Hawaiian petrels. They're like, they can be quite amazingly vigorous in their defense. But time will tell with those two.
Well, yeah, so to put it more specifically, it sounds like they're hoping for more sympatric occupation of that spot than is reflected in your data, or am I not connecting that's correctly?
So that area is kind of down-ish here-ish, and both species fly over those areas, and both species breed around those areas. So I think it would be not unreasonable to expect to get both in there. And you can try to do things like segregate them within the site to different parts of the site. But yeah, I mean, I think both should be attracted to all of those kind of colonies. There's another fence, which I'll talk about in a bit, up here. And the idea will be to try to attract both species to that fenced area.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
So Andre, this is Loyal. How about Kilauea Point? Because that has at least one of these, right?
So Kilauea.
Are there any wedgies there?
Yes, so Kilauea is the site of an egg swap project from the 80s where Niue shearwaters were actually taken out of Kuluhonu and Kalaheo colony, I believe, and the eggs were put underneath Niue wedge-tailed shearwater parents, and all those birds mainly fledged, and then a small number of them have come back and continue to breed at Kilauea. Kilauea is interesting because the mules are nesting in amongst a huge colony of wedge-tailed shearwaters, and there's absolutely no doubt that the wedge-tail is a far more aggressive species. Again, anyone who's handled wedge-tails, I mean, it's like you put your hand through a meat grinder at the end if you're handling them, lots of them unprotected. And they will easily attack mules and boot them out of nests. So we have seen that time and time again at Kilauea. So that's definitely a consideration. The wedge-tail is certainly a nest competitor and likes similar nesting habitat from both species. And so that's something that just needs to be thought about from a management perspective in those areas. And luckily, there are no wedge-tails up in the mountains.
And for Kilauea, was that in your targeted or estimated habitat suitability area for newels?
Yes, I believe Kilauea did crop up. And Kilauea is interesting because if you look at it, the habitat is totally different. It's like a coastal area where the birds there are nesting underneath pala trees, for example, in some cases just in the leaf litter. They're in these really fragile burrows that have been burrowed out inside big piles of leaf litter, or within the spiky roots of the hala tree. So, but broadly speaking, the burrow characteristics from microhabitat point of view are very similar to what they're nesting at up in these areas.
Andre, I got another question for you. It's a little bit out of the box, but you've been sharing about your data relating to the breeding colonies and occupation of those habitats. I have a question about the foraging or feeding habitats in areas. Is there sympatric habitat in that regard? I'm particularly curious because there's a lot of projects to propose offshore wind projects. I'm wondering about what our knowledge of where these birds are feeding when they're around.
Yeah, we have some awesome data on foraging areas for both species, and I'll come to that later in the slideshow. Both species, we've got really good data on that. Okay. This is just a slide outside of those management areas showing that in these really super inaccessible spots like the Nepali, saw meters are a great way of looking at the distribution of species too. And you can see this sort of like, really high call rates across the Napali for Newell shearwater. I didn't actually put the map on for Hawaiian Petrol, but if I had, it would just be little red dots because there's nothing going on there. And if I was to put a map on for storm petrels, you'd see storm petrel call rates all across these sites too. So those saw meters, as I'm sure a lot of the speakers today will be talking about, the saw meters are really awesome ways of just getting a better handle on distribution of birds across larger areas. So that's sort of a quick overview on the way that birds are being monitored over time or within sites for management on Kauai. The rest of this is going to be focused on threats, and I was just going to walk us through each of the main threats out here, which broadly speaking are going to be the threats that face these birds across the Hawaiian Islands and how those threats are being tackled. So we'll start with powerline collisions. Powerline collisions in recent years have been found to be a major threat for both species. And you have power lines that are found around the island, anywhere where there's roads, and then also power lines that cross the interior of the island. This one here is the power line trail that cuts straight through the middle of the island. And so we'll just have a quick look at how this problem has been assessed, firstly, in terms of how bad the situation is, like how have we figured that, how has that been figured out, and secondly, ways in which that can be reduced. So the first is grounded birds. In the last decade, there have been 89 grounded Newell shearwater and Hawaiian Petrel found underneath power lines. These are just some examples showing injuries to the birds themselves. It can often be fairly non-dramatic, like you just get like a tiny little missing patch of feathers where the bird's like, nailed the power line, skimmed off the side of it, broken its neck, but you just find a tiny little patch of feathers missing. Or major impact wounds like this one here, the poor bird's head has basically been caved in. We've also seen split beaks too if a bird hits it head on. And grounded birds has been one of the main ways of looking at power line collisions in the past. If birds are found underneath power lines, information is collected on where they were, what species they were, that kind of information. But it's quite limited because there's a lot of power lines. A lot of those power lines, the vast majority of them, as I'll show you in a bit, are over areas where no one's ever going to find a bird that hits a line and goes and drops. Also, there are birds that hit power lines and fall, 500 meters, a kilometer away. You're never going to find those either. So this is interesting information and useful information, but not the way that that you can come to get to grips with how serious the threat of power line collisions are. So the next is observations, and observations involve being there in these sites at night, using night vision and IR to help illuminate the area and get a better visual of a power line. And then spending hours and hours and hours staring at these power lines, trying not to go mad, watching shooting stars in the background, that kind of thing. And getting collisions and recording collisions as they happen. And so there've been over 120 collisions that have been recorded over 6,400 hours of observations. So a lot of time and effort. And I'll just give you a couple of quick videos. Hopefully this works. This is of a Newell shearwater that's flying towards a power line and narrowly avoids it. You see it flare up there. We'll just go back and see it again. Quick flare as it passes between the power lines. And if you think this is a really long stretch of power line, this has actually been illuminated with an IR illuminator to help see things better in this area. But that's, if you've been sitting there for 2 hours staring at that, you got to be really on the ball to catch that quick movement. And that's actually a bird that's flying fairly close. If this is a bird that was flying down here, you gotta be even more awake. Here is a second one, which actually shows a collision. And I'll just play that one again, just in case you missed it. Again, it's a split-second thing, which is in a small area in which you're observing. And so those two techniques, which are finding grounding birds, finding grounding birds and undertaking observations gives really interesting and important information. And there's actually just been a study published on that, post-collision impacts, crippling bias, and environmental bias in the study of Neil Shearwater.
Andre, sorry, did that bird live or die?
That one's a dead one. Yeah, I mean, it just drops. Probably
Get
broke.
varnish next time, man. That was not easy to watch. Thanks.
Yep. Yeah, they aren't easy to watch at all. But that information basically gives you, it allows you to understand, firstly, where where some of these collisions are occurring, and secondly, very importantly, what happens to a bird when it collides with a power line. And this graph here shows that you've got a proportion of them that are immediately grounded. It's about 13%. And then you've got varying percentages of what happens to birds. Some of them will skim off and drop in the distance. Many of them will keep on going. And I think that's one of the really interesting things about these kind of observations, is that while you get a lot of collisions, it doesn't mean that bird's going to drop dead. A lot of them are going to fly away. And then the question arises, well, when they fly away, what happens to them afterwards? Because you could have a bird which is concussed. You could have a bird which is missing patches of feathers, which would be a thermoregulation issue. Or you could just have a bird which skimmed off it and went on its way, and nothing's happened to it. So there's sort of the great unknowns, those birds that don't immediately drop. But this is a map from that paper showing areas where observed collisions have occurred. This is the Powerline Trail, and this is around LA. And then these are all birds that have been found and their distribution. There's a really big pocket of downed birds in the Lawai area where there's a big power line spanning that valley, and a lot of power lines just outside Hanapepe, which interesting also is there's a lot of biologists that are driving these roads. So, part of the pattern of this will also be just people on the lookout for a bird and then willing to actually stop and scrape a pancaked, bleeding, guts all over the place bird off the ground and collect it. A lot of people aren't willing to do that either. So really important information, really important for understanding what happens to birds after they hit the lines, but not the whole story. And so,
Andre, sorry,
yep.
while you have that pulled up, when were those power lines constructed?
The Powerline Trail was after Aniki.
That's what I was wondering, because that has never seemed like a coincidence to me, and that those numbers that you showed earlier of the 94% decline between 93 and 2013, anyone who's been in Hawaii long enough knows what happened prior to 93. And so is there, I don't know, can you just talk a little bit about that? Is there a link between the timing of that construction and the decline of those birds, the dramatic decline?
Well, the Powerline Trail is, and I'll show you a figure shortly of that area, but it is definitely one of the main collision hotspots on the island of Kauai. And if you think about those lines, they're basically bisecting that area, going through good habitat with breeding birds on either side, or what would have been large breeding colonies in the past. So I don't think there can be any doubt that that particular construction and area has been a driving force for a decline in the areas where those birds are passing through that particular stretch.
Okay, I really appreciate that. And I think one of the things that's just on my mind as we start talking more and more about the upcoming changes is that like potentially with offshore wind or other major infrastructure changes that could take place over the next decade or two, I think it's really important to remember that some of these single decisions that cause major changes to the landscape, when they are impacting something that's in a zone that birds interact with daily. If there's even a death a day or a death every other day, those can take a species or a population that's in abundance and stable and dramatically decline it over a decade or two. And I don't know, thinking about a lot of different species that we have here in Hawaii, I think that's just one of the things that stands out to me about this particular story, and something that we need to take as a really important lesson as we consider new changes in the future. So just wanted to note that.
Yeah, I think these kind of observations and research that have not only occurred here, but also on other Hawaiian islands, they're good messages for people to think about in terms of future construction projects. there's a lot of information now on areas which would be good or bad, conversely for endangered species, and using that information prevents the problem in the first place from happening.
Hey, Andre, this is Rogelio. I have two questions. One, I'm unfamiliar as far as if there's a height difference of the power lines. Have you guys discovered if there is a difference between power lines that are shorter in height versus longer or taller? And then also, do some of these power lines have an additional light source, like night lights that are posted along the streets, if there's a difference with that as well?
Yeah, the height is definitely a thing, which is a contributing factor. It depends though on the location. So bird flight heights and power line heights are, the combination of the two is what is going to make you know whether or not that area is going to be bad for power line collisions or not. So you might have low power lines, but if they're in areas where birds are flying low, then you're going to have a problem. Conversely, you might have high power lines, which are in areas where birds are flying even higher, like on the North Shore of Kauai. A lot of those areas, they're pretty high, but the birds are flying high anyway. It's that deadly combination of the two where either they're high or low, but they're corresponding with where the flight heights the majority of the birds that leads to the problem, if that makes sense. And then lighting, that's, street lights related to power lines. You certainly in the fallout season, when you've got birds circling areas, anything that's around them as they're circling is going to cause them to either collide or stall and go down. So that could be power lines, it could be buildings, it could be anything. And you do watch birds as they're circling lights coming into contact with any obstruction and resulting in them being grounded. Luckily, the big power lines that are go through the middle of the island, they don't have lights on them.
Andrea, I have a follow-up question to Melissa's. So in '93, so before the power lines went, I was just wondering if these birds were endangered at that point. I'm pretty sure they were. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting when you look at the history of both species. I mean, the mules was basically thought functionally extinct until being rediscovered in the late 60s by a hunter's dog which had a bunch of feathers in his mouth, which turned out to be mules. So, and that was in the Kalaheo area, or no, it was maybe it was Anahola, one of those two mountains. Anyway, so, and also the Hawaiian Petrol, there were no burrows even found until much more recently. So I don't know what their status was in terms of regulatory, but they were certainly both species that were known to be endangered, threatened, or endangered.
Okay, thank you.
And so this figure here just kind of illustrates that point about, if you use observations and grounded birds for power line collisions, the red areas are areas where this shows which areas are searchable. And you can see here in red, these are basically functionally not searchable. So this is a power line trail. A lot of these areas, you just basically a bird may go immediately down underneath the power line. Like you can see, this is looking down across the power line trail. Bird may drop immediately into that, but your chance of ever finding that are, I would say, 0. And the only areas where you can find them are these, along roadsides and so on, which if you look at this area here, this is where a lot of those birds were found, if you remember that previous map. So there needed to be a different way of assessing the issue of power line collisions that got to the root of the problem. And that's these guys. So saw meters have been absolutely key for understanding the impact of power line collisions, how bad it is, where it is, and ultimately how the issue can be reversed. I'll just play you a couple of sounds. This is the kind of thing that these saw meters are listening for. Did you guys hear that? So you've got that twanging noise, and you can actually hear the bird call after it hits. That's a bird hitting a power line, expelling its and calling as it immediately after hitting the line. Here's another one. So those are two of the more dramatic sound clips we have, but that twanging noise, that noise there is what the saw meter is listening out for, and it's the sound of a bird hitting a line. It doesn't tell you what happens to that bird afterwards, but it is a bird, that's a bird hitting a line. And that information, knowing that that occurs and spending a lot of time, which I won't go into now because I'm looking at the time actually and sort of already an hour through, but suffice to say that we've looked into this really carefully about, what other things could be hitting lines, the relationship between these sounds and the timing of bird movement, the time when the birds are on the islands, and these sounds correspond totally with the time when the birds are moving through the mountains, the time when they're on the islands, and in these areas there's nothing else that can be making those sounds. There have been a couple of occasions where, particularly the one that really sticks in mind is the Kahili Mountains, where there was this weird pattern of collision sounds, and those immediately jumped out at the team as being not birds, and they were found to be a loose wire that was banging against the pole. So, there's certainly some mechanical things that can occur, but the good news is that with those strange mechanical things, they pick up you can pick them up really easily because they're normally rhythmic, or they're occurring during the day as well as the night. And so you can tease those out really quickly. So this whole thing, of which there's been now near a decade of research on the use of acoustics for measuring Powerline collisions, is really a finessed technique now for understanding the issue of Powerline collisions. Oops, sorry, don't want to subject you to that call again.
Andre?
Yeah.
Sorry for all the interruptions. Is there any way of telling the size of the bird from the sound of the strike? Because I'm curious about, and I don't know that these are necessarily by mass. Well, anyways, you have quite a few more pueo, other unlisted species on the island that we still would care about. Their deaths by collisions, and certainly pueo are known to have collision risks with many kinds of objects. Are there other species, I guess, other than these two, and is there any way of distinguishing between them?
Yeah, so firstly, there's a timing thing. So when it comes to measuring seabird collisions, the times that are anything outside of the period when the birds are moving are immediately discounted. So anything that may occur during the day, for example, is not included in these kind of assessments. And then if you think about a pueo, they are very, they're very sparsely distributed across these areas, and they have acute vision. It's not to say that they may not collide with the power line, but if they did, it would be an extremely rare occurrence. And when you consider the number of collisions that are occurring, it would be like a drop in the ocean. And so
I think from a monitoring perspective, as far as knowing whether it was a listed or unlisted species for mitigation reasons, that totally makes sense. From a relatively rare species perspective, the number that could be killed through those collisions, I think from a population proportion perspective, collisions are a major cause of death for pueo. And so even though they do keep a good eye out, I don't know why, but they seem to run into stuff a lot, relatively speaking. So.
Yeah, and I would say, so those thousands of hours that have been spent observing up in the mountains, I can't even remember if there's even been a single visual of that occurring. But I would say down on the coastal areas, along those roads, I wouldn't be surprised if it occurs, more regularly. And there are places where there's more work being done to understand, for example, the impact of water birds in areas where there's a lot of water bird traffic. And so this kind of work is the product ongoing, but a product of a lot of many hours of observations and understanding what the birds do, and then finessing it as time passes. And this is this map is basically what the result of those song meters shows. We've got 13,668 collisions annually. This ignore this brackets. This is not prior to any minimization. Minimization has occurred on these lines. Sorry, that's an error there. So just reiterate, this is not prior to any minimization. And of those, 13% were immediately grounded based on those observations that have been made over time. And that's a staggeringly large number. And that means a lot of downed birds, which is obviously really bad news. But the good news is, if you look at this map, immediately when you look at it, you can see where the problems are. And I think that's really important to understand. This is a big problem, but it's also a big problem in key areas. And if you know that, then you know the areas that you need to target to reduce this problem to a manageable issue. And when you combine that information with information like this, this is tracking work that has been done using data loggers to look at the pathways of birds flying in and out of areas, and particularly on the northwest side of the island. And this kind of information, you get really interesting insights into bird behavior. Like this, for example, this red line here is Newell shearwaters transiting into Upper Limahuli, and you can see these birds are all following what is basically like a Newell superhighway up into the colony. So identifying those those highways can give you further insight into critical areas. Likewise, you can see this one here. This is actually a Hawaiian Petrol that, in this case, did something quite odd. It cut across the island, unlike all of the other birds, but it actually flew at or below or slightly above, depending on where it was, across the Powerline Trail, which is, as the other previous figure showed, a major area for Powerline collisions. So getting some insight into these birds' flyways and flight heights and flight behavior can also help to understand the ways in which collisions can be mitigated for. And so there are ways, multiple ways of dealing with that. Sorry, Kavika, did you say something? No, okay. Yeah, so one of the most obvious ways of dealing with this is just removing the lines altogether. Obviously, if the lines don't exist in the airspace, then the birds aren't going to collide with them in the first place. And that's a really obvious scenario. It's a costly one, but in areas where there's lots of collisions occurring, it may be the one that you would go with. The other solution is to increase visibility of the power lines. And this kind of may seem a little counterintuitive in terms of increasing visibility with things like lights, if light is an attractive thing for birds. But several techniques have been trialed on Kauai. One is the laser fence. The idea here was to project lasers in front of power lines like this. And then the concept was that the bird would fly towards it, see those lasers. It wouldn't see the power lines, it would see the lasers, and then divert up and over the area. And that had some degree of success, some good success, but is also a high-tech technique that comes with issues like power sources diminishing, perhaps in mist, the lasers are much less visible. A lower tech solution is diverters. Here's an example of some diverters. I think these ones are just outside Hanapepe. There's a variety of diverters that can be used, including LED ones, which flash lights, and reflective ones. And again, it's just to give that bird that split-second warning that there's something in the airspace that it's flying towards and allow it to divert up and over. And it's not a new technique. It's one that's used around the world. I just include below here South Africa. They've been using this for blue crane, which was a big issue for the blue crane, and it's been highly effective in those areas at reducing collisions. And work is ongoing on Kauai to understand the effectiveness of these diverters for reducing powerline collisions. But these are ways in which we can reduce the collisions to a point where they become less of a species level risk to the birds. The next one is light, and I'm sure everyone's well aware of light attraction. I don't really think I'll go over it, but I haven't included a lot of slides on this, and maybe some of the other speakers might talk more about it, but Kauai is well known for light attraction, particularly for fledglings. The Newell shearwater between 79 and 2019, there were 31,812 fledglings that were handed into the Save Our Shearwaters project. Actually, 96% of those are fledglings. There are some adults that are attracted from time to time, particularly at the beginning of the season. Interestingly enough, Hawaiian Petrols, there's very few numbers handed in each year. These birds seem to be much less affected by light pollution, at least from a fledgling point of view, or maybe they're just not flying over well brightly lit areas. But this really is on Kauai majorly a Newell shearwater fledgling issue. And I always find it, quite sad to find these birds that have spent the entire breeding season, navigating all the risks that the adults have to get up there to feed them, and then they don't get predated, and then they fly away, get attracted to lights, end up on the ground either miserably staring at a warehouse wall or getting run over by cars. It's quite a sad thing to see. Luckily, Kauai does have Save Our Shearwaters and public participation for collecting birds and passing them in, handing them in for rehab. It is not just a fledgling issue, though. it can be an issue for adults. The classic example on Kauai was the Koke Air Force Station, where there's a huge fallout event related to bright lights in 2015, where birds were just being pulled down. And if you look at the location of this, it's right next to major breeding colonies on the northwest of the island. So if you have bright lights in an area where there's breeding birds, then you are going to attract breeding adults. And so in those scenarios, it can be an adult issue as well. And it is related also to moon. And everybody who works with the seabirds knows this, that, you know, if you've got high illumination, then your fallout is going to be low. And if you've got new moon in the middle of a fallout season, then you're going to get a lot of fallout. And each year, I know the Save Our Shearwaters crew look at the moon illumination and think, uh-oh, this is going to be a bad year, or great, this is going to be not such a bad year, depending on the moon illumination. And the key to this is, I mean, it's very simple, reduce. If those lights get turned off, like that example of the Air Force Station, you can see on the left what the lights were like, and on the right what they're like now. If those lights go off, then the birds aren't going to be attracted. It's quite a stark difference, and this is what you see. So this is that huge fallout in 2015. The lights were left on just at the beginning of the fallout, the breeding season, 2016. 2 birds came down, they're immediately turned off. And from that point onwards, the lights have been massively reduced. And so no birds in the last few years. In 2020, 1 bird was grounded that was found on camera to show, you know, that even with low lights, you can get the occasional bird brought down. But reducing those lights is absolutely paramount. And I did want to take that opportunity just to highlight, I feel like Kauai, you know, everybody knows about light attraction and light pollution being an issue, and there's been really great public communications campaigns and big movements to reduce that. But I have noticed in recent years that some places things are slipping. You do get these, I mean, these are crazy bright lights here that I took last year. And I mean, there's no reason for them to be like that. And I think we shouldn't take our eye off the ball with light attraction. It is one of those ones which can, you know, if it's left to their own devices, managers at hotels change, new staff come and go, and that just reminding people about lights is really important, because otherwise, you know, you're going to end up with a situation where you've got really bright lights in areas and you're going to start getting a lot of birds coming down again. And if you combine that with the fact that these are often areas where there are cats as well, then the combo there is a bad one, because a grounded bird is super vulnerable to a cat or being run over by a car. So I think that's just one thing to keep. Everyone just needs to remember that light attraction is a thing, and it's been one that has been highlighted on Kauai, and a lot of people are taking, you know, there's a lot of really great work to reduce from a lot of people and a lot of companies and hotels, but you just got to keep remembering that it's a big issue.
Hey, Andre, this is Riley. I had a question. Has anyone looked at, as far as the power of the lumens? I know for the military, in order for us to do conservation measures for the Hawaiian hoary bat, we've recommended, you know, to shield the lights downward and use amber lights. What are your thoughts as far as, is there specific lights that you would recommend?
Yeah, it's interesting that, and that's a huge body of research. You look at like all these different papers that have come out around the world dealing with this issue, and you know the take-home messages are always, you just don't want them bright. You want them as reduced as possible. You want to be able to have them on, say, for example, timers if you can, where they're only turned on when they're needed. You want to be shielding those lights from upward radiation, so it's not attracting birds they fly over. And then the color of light is really important too. I wouldn't be surprised if Jay is going to talk more on this, because Jay had a paper with colleagues that came out recently. So maybe I'll leave that particular aspect to a later speaker to talk about. But it's definitely all about the intensity of light, shielding, and type of light.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Andre. So I'm sorry for all the questions, but you're doing great job. This is very helpful. So when you see lights like that, what is the process for getting those places compliant and making sure that those incidences are documented properly?
I think at the moment the protocol would be to just contact the state, and then the state seabird biologist or wildlife biologist would then talk to the landowner.
So all those pictures you showed, did that process happen, or is that something that still needs to happen?
They were reported, those lights.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. And, you know, it's not I wouldn't even say you don't need to go in and be like shaking your fist at people. You just need to be like, hey guys, don't forget, like, this is a really major issue, and you don't want to have a big issue with endangered seabirds here. And lights like those, which are unshielded and super bright and pointing up and around, I mean, they're not necessary, and they can be easily fixed. I think they're easy fixes. And my feeling is people generally, there's definitely people who they're just forgetting because it's new staff. And that if it's a quick and easy fix, why not, you know, people are willing to do it. But you just gotta be reminded.
Andre, is that a DoCare follow-up, or who's the enforcement end on that?
I don't know that. I guess that'll be a question for DOFAW.
Is DOFAW on the call and able to answer that?
Well, this is Jay. I think actually it really varies by island. On Maui, we don't have the same kind of situation. We have Save Our Seabirds here, and my staff go to the site of fallout when they happen. We publicize the contact information so that they know to call us. We go there oftentimes in the evening when it happened, or the next day when the birds are found. And we communicate that. We have literature to give them about turn your lights down, shield them, use long wavelength light. You want to eliminate all that short wavelength light. And then for enforcement, of course, we cannot do any of that. Maui County has a reasonably weak outdoor lighting ordinance, but it does require that light is below the horizontal. No light can shine above it. And we recently asked for, it's called a request for service with the Public Works Department. And they actually made it there. It took them a couple months, but they went and they actually disconnected the power to the, it was a surf shop who was lighting up coconut trees, and then required that the lights themselves be removed. And I think it's something that we need on all of the islands to do more work with, is to get improved outdoor lighting ordinances. Hawaii Island has short wavelength light eliminated from most all its street lights, but they have much less of a fallout problem there than we do, or Kauai is much more extreme even than we are.
Okay. So yeah, and from the rescue perspective, what you said makes sense. On the enforcement side, I understand it varies among islands, but it sounds like something that should be standardized. And I'd maybe just stick a pin in this for, I see that Afshin is on the call, to perhaps have a conversation about making that as a standard thing across the islands, as far as who is following up on the enforcement side of ensuring that the lights are in compliance.
I can speak a little bit to that for Kauai Island. We work very closely with DoCare, and we have freezers that we retain the carcass once it's picked up and the investigation is ongoing. And so we retain that for ongoing use that's needed for these investigations, with oftentimes can take quite some time. So we have a standard protocol. We work very closely with them. What are the outcomes of those investigations and what are the ramifications? That I could not speak to very clearly. So I do think that there could be a little more of a cycle in what happens in the end. And was it education? Was it enforcement? Was it, what was it? But in terms of people that have lighting issues, we get input from the public and folks like Andre and other conservationists that let us know when they see somebody that seems to have, egregious lighting, and we have a informational protocol that we go see them, we give them information that's very clear, and the options of the lighting that they could switch to. So certainly it's not a perfect process, but I think it has been standardized, at least for Kauai.
Cole Hendrickson has been contracted to analyze the DoCare data statewide, and that might be something, if ESRC is interested in, that we could request a summary report of the outcomes of any things related to light ordinances or something that DoCare responded to.
So guys, I see I've got half an hour left, and I honestly, I don't want to run into everyone else's talks, because I know there's a lot of really great speakers today. So I might just, and I do have a lot of slides to get through. So maybe I should just ask that for now we stop any more questions. I know that there might be a lot, and I'm happy to answer them maybe offline, or if there's something that's really key that I say where you're like, what the heck, then perhaps interject there if that's all right with everyone. Is that okay? Okay. Okay, so we did talk about the Save Our Shear Orders and the awesome work that organization does to protect, to rescue and rehabilitate and release birds. They are a really dedicated team. I think the one thing that's interesting to note there is we have, there's always been this big question about whether rescue and rehabilitation works. The birds are all banded and released, but band recoveries have always been very, very low. And is that an indication that birds aren't surviving, or is it just an indication that there's no effort to look for the birds because they're breeding in really remote areas, and looking for banded birds is like a needle in a haystack? So we did do a study to look at that and to assess the post-release survival of fallout mule shearwaters from SOS. The idea here was to attach satellite tags to wild birds and also birds that were going through rehabilitation in different cohorts, either birds that were rescued and released on the same day, birds that spent 1 day in rehab, or birds that spent more than 2 days. And the take-home message, that paper is there. You can see it. It's in Endangered Species Research. If you haven't read it and you want to know more, that's the place to look for it. The take-home message was that, perhaps unsurprisingly, birds that get grounded by light attraction and are picked up by humans and rehabilitated and released have a lower survival rate than birds that just fledge naturally. I don't think that's something that's surprising. Also, that birds that are in longer rehabilitation have a lower survival rate than birds that pass through rehabilitation quickly. So there is definitely a reduced survival rate for birds that are rescued and released. But on the flip side, some of those birds do survive. They do survive, and they go out to sea and they do the same migration routes that all the other birds do. So I think it's a really important thing to note that although birds that go through SOS will have a reduced survival rate, some of them do survive, and it's really important to keep a project like that going, because the one thing that's for sure is that if the bird's left on the ground and not rescued, its survival rate is basically 0. And so this project has had an important role to play in the conservation of these species. Okay, the next threat is introduced predators. I feel like kind of preaching to the choir here with everyone that's on this call, but introduced predators are a major threat to these birds. It always strikes me as a reminder: if you go to an area, no matter how remote, with no trails, you land in a helicopter on this remote ridge line, you're going to find, if there were birds there, you're going to find predation occurring, and that can be by cats. Of which feral cats are spread across the landscape, feral pigs, rats, particularly black rat and Norwegian rat, and the barn owl, which is its own special case as an introduced predator, an avian predator. So predators are a major impact to the birds that are breeding in these islands. And on Kauai, this is one of the main reasons why, at least in the breeding grounds, they're being contracted into more and more inaccessible areas to predators. And these are the kind of signs that you find. The way of understanding the impact of predators is both through the cameras and also through identification of field sign. You've got cat kills here, rat kill of a Hawaiian Petrol there. That's actually incidentally the first Hawaiian Petrol I ever saw. Was that particular bird killed by a rat in Upper Limahuli. So it was quite a wake-up call to see that bird and be like, okay, this is a big problem. And this one is absolutely staggering kill that was found just a couple of weeks ago of a Hawaiian Petrol that a barn owl had taken out. You can see it's basically stripped the bird's spine out with its head and its legs. And then the wings were separated, but the keel stripped out, and there's a big barn owl pellet in the middle of it. So this kind of sign is, broadly speaking, quite dramatic, and you can, in most cases, figure out what the predator was. And then the solutions, of course, are predator control. And there's a lot of awesome work being carried out on Kauai by organizations like NTBG in Upper Limahuli, by HALEX in a lot of the Honolulu areas, by a lot of the state teams to deal with these predators. It's often a thankless job. Spend countless hours out in the mountains trying to protect the birds from what seems to be a relentless horde of invasive introduced predators. There's a lot of techniques that are out there: ungulate fencing, live and kill traps for cats, the good nature trap, which is pretty much a game changer for rat control in these areas. And then more interesting ways of dealing with things, particularly barn owls are a tricky one. So night spotting and shooting, pig brigs, this kind of thing. I think predator control has been one of those interesting management techniques to watch over time, because as new technologies come out, predator control teams adapt to what's available, just like the predators adapt to different techniques. So it's an ever-changing management issue. But the results are promising. With cats, for example, this is one site with a number of cats removed in any given year. I think that, that one kind of says it all to me, that cats will just keep coming. They keep on coming. You just got to keep removing them, because these borders are porous and cats are everywhere. But if you do keep removing them, then you do see results. And this is cat visits on cameras at one of the sites. You can see these, there's a much less cat visitation on burrows now in this particular site than there were at the beginning. And likewise, predation. Poakea is a good one, because this site here, we actually had 12 birds killed in 1 year. And the last like 3 or 4 years has been basically nothing. So if you remove the predator, then it's not going to kill the birds, which is kind of obvious, but it's nice to see that actually happening in practice in these areas. The same with rats. On the left is one area in Limahuli in 2 years as eradication rat control was occurring with good natures. And you can see the black rat kills are going down because there's less and less black rats. And conversely, the number of predations, percentage of burrows that are being predated is going down, down, down. And black rat predation is one that really does respond well to predator control. Barn owls, on the other hand, are a tricky one, because they require really specialized control methods and highly trained predator control operatives. And barn owls move over large areas. They're obviously aerial predators. Often their kills are not easy to find, because they'll kill a bird as it's coming into it, as it's on its way in. I've watched them actually, it's like a dog fight. They'll try to push birds out of the air and bring them down to the ground so they can take them out. They're possibly taking a lot of subadults as well, which aren't associated with burrows, so it's hard to actually get a handle on the depredation levels. But this is a species that keeps on killing, and it definitely requires some really specialized control techniques. And we have seen in these sites where management is ongoing that reproductive success rates have increased over time this is mules and Hawaiian Petrol, black and gray. In the early years, low reproductive success rates. Now it's kind of like bobbing along in general at a pretty high level. And so reproductive success has increased. And that corresponds with an increase in call rates. So this, I showed you this graph earlier, but this is Limahuli, and you can see like just this ever marching increase of call rates increasing over time, which even if you take that to be subadults, just means more and more subadults, that perhaps chicks that weren't killed by rats coming back years later to start breeding again. I think it's a really positive thing. It's the same with Hawaiian Petrols. This is the exact same site. Hawaiian Petrol calls over time. It's this increasing call rate. And I think, these kind of metrics, call rate change over time, reproductive success rate change over time, show in real time how effective and important management is within these areas. We did have a look at this as well by doing population simulation models. This paper is published in Journal of Wildlife Management, and we used inputs in one scenario where we inputted limited predator control using variables that were in place in those sites before predator control really kicked off. And if you just use those inputs in the population simulation models, you see all these sites just basically over time disappearing and dropping significantly in numbers. Whereas if you use the variables that we now have with full predator control in place, populations are increasing over time. And I think that sort of overall trend is you can see that in the models, but you can also see that in real-time data that management most definitely works. It's expensive and it takes a lot of time and effort and people power. It can be a real grind for predator control teams to be out there day after day trying to catch and remove, in many cases, really wily predators. But I think, if you see that is actually having a significant impact on endangered seabirds in these areas, then it can actually make those teams feel a lot better about themselves. There is, though, however, it's not all roses. Last year, a cat got into Hanakapiai and killed 14 Hawaiian Petrol chicks in just 3 days. And that's just a sample of some of those birds that were killed. And that's, you know, a real shame. If you look at the numbers, like suddenly you go from pretty much nothing to this big boost in kills. That cap was removed pretty quickly, but it just shows how devastating a single predator can be in an area, even over a short period of time. And so if that cat had been left to its own device and not been caught, the catastrophe would have been a lot worse. But these kind of sporadic one-off episodes where a super killer gets into a colony, they're much less frequent than they would have been without predator control, but they are still an issue, and highlight, you know, particularly with cats, how important that particular predator is for the endangered seabirds breeding up in the mountains of Kauai and across the Hawaiian Islands. And we don't even have to deal, knock on wood, with mongoose yet. So that's, you know, another one which I know many of my colleagues have to deal with on a regular basis. So that's where, you know, predator control is absolutely fundamental. It's a management technique which everybody's using. It has results, but the next step up is predator-proof fences and social attraction. And that's another really important management technique that's occurring on Kauai. It's hard to put predator-proof fences in many of the areas where the birds breed. You can see, I mean, these are sort of examples of areas where the birds breed. This is the Nahoku fence, which is set up in a lowland area. But that kind of setup in the mountains is not a common one. And so there are various sites that are now up and running with, or in the process. I'll quickly go through some of the ones. And I think Lindsay will be talking about some of these areas perhaps in more detail. But just to highlight that this is a technique that is being used on Kauai. It's an important one, but is limited to areas. So for example, in Limahuli, to protect Hawaiian petrels and annual shearwaters, there's a plan to replace the existing ungulate fence with a predator-proof fence. That'll be an amazing project when it's completed, because it's a large area, 150 hectares plus, in really, you know, remote and difficult terrain. But it would protect, with an ungulate fence, I mean, with a predator-proof fence, the largest monitored population of annual shearwaters plus Hawaiian petrels. Then we have Upper Minoa. This is another site where there's plans for predator-proof fence. There's already in place artificial nest boxes that have been put there. Here they are. These went in a year or so ago. The idea is to get these in place before the fence goes up, so that they're ready to go once the fence is in place. You can see that's an overview of the site with a helicopter next to it. Nice sort of pu'u with good slopes on either side. On a actually one of the main flyways for annual shearwaters going into the further on up into the valleys. This site would be for both mules and Hawaiian petrels, and there has also been recent habitat restoration, which often, of course, goes hand in hand with predator-proof fences. You know, it's not just, a predator-proof fence is not just going to protect the birds, but it's going to protect rare plants and native habitats from things like rats, for example, or ungulates. And so they're important restoration sites, not just for the seabirds themselves, but for the ecosystem in general. Poakea is a fence where construction is occurring at the moment. It's a small one, but it's situated right above a large area of nesting annual shearwaters, as well as Hawaiian petrels nearby. The idea here would be to have a predator-proof fence around this little bowl, and then have social attraction to pull birds into the area. It's in an area where there's a lot of birds nearby, so this one has a really good chance of success. And then Honopu, another site where there's fence construction occurring as we speak, and artificial nest boxes are now in place. This one's an exciting one because it's going to be not just for annual shearwaters and Hawaiian petrels, but also for our poor neglected band-rump storm petrel. And these are actually band-rump storm petrel nest boxes that have gone in there. So this site, once the predator-proof fence is up and running, social attraction will begin, and hopefully we'll start seeing birds coming into these areas and breeding. So these are, you know, this is the kind of gold standard of management, having a predator-proof fence around a site. But like I said, it's not possible to do in many, indeed most of the situations where management is occurring in the remote mountainous areas. And therefore, in those cases, then keeping predator control at a high level, annual, year after year, is the only way that those birds are going to be protected in those sites. And then the alternative is to not set a fence up in an existing area, but to set up a fence in an area where birds don't currently breed, but where it's logistically easy to get to. So that's the Nahoku project. And that translocation was started in 2015 there. So you can see, people collecting shearwaters and Hawaiian petrels from these remote mountainous areas and translocating them to the Nahoku fence site. There are 110 Hawaiian petrels and 85 Neal shearwaters. The vast majority of them fledged due to the hard work of the PRC team that were dealing with the birds on the ground once they were translocated to the site. And Hawaiian petrels actually started returning in 2020. And this project is a really good example of how important it is to have partnerships with large numbers of different organizations with different strengths to get a project that's up and running. And it'll be really interesting to see how this project develops in the future. There are a lot of different organizations involved with this one and different funding sources. And there's a website there to look at too, I'm sure everyone's familiar with it, but there's information on the www.nahoku.org. Translocation is a tricky one though, because you need to have birds to translocate from. And as you take birds away from colonies, you are taking birds away from colonies, and the idea is that they go to the new colony. So they're not going to go back to that old colony. And there aren't a lot of accessible birds to translocate, and it takes a lot of time and effort to do translocation. So I think translocation is an important tool in the toolbox, but it also comes with a range of logistical issues and cost issues. And I think it's appropriate in some cases. For example, the Nahoku project, there's a very limited chance that would succeed without translocation, or at least it would take a lot longer. But it's not the kind of thing which you want to just jump feet first into straight off the bat, because there's a lot of time and effort involved. And you can't really be taking birds from colonies unless there's predator control in place, because otherwise you're just creating trails to these areas where the predators will then immediately get to the birds before you can even translocate them. So a lot to think about with translocation. And these guys are the main one to also think about, is that even if you've got a predator-proof fence in place, and even if everything's running smoothly, the barn owl is not restricted by a predator-proof fence, and in fact may use your predator-proof fence to perch on. And it's going to be attracted to the activity and sound that's occurring in a social attraction site. So again, they are very, very tricky species to deal with. They require a lot of time and effort to deal with them. And people do need to focus on this particular bird, because it's a beautiful bird, but it's a deadly predator, and one that can swiftly put an end to the successes of a social attraction site if left unchecked.
Andre, I know we're not asking questions, but I just wanted to throw out there the two fences, predator-proof fences, the state are financing. We are going to be experimenting with different applications on the top of the predator-proof fence to see if that dissuades, repels the barn owl from using that as a perch. So we'll keep track of those investigations and let folks know how it goes.
Awesome. Thanks for letting us know that, Sherry. Yeah, it is one of those things where you just you look at the fence, you're like, okay, this is great, but now you've got a bunch of places for a bird to perch on. So it's great to think about ways of stopping that from happening in the first place. And I've got 15 minutes left, so I don't want to gloss over these other things because they are all important threats. But I'm also sure that some of the other speakers will be dealing with some of these things. But I did want to mention them because they are important to consider for Kauai. Introduced plants, like if you look at things like guava, these horrendous guava forests that are now the norm in many of these areas. Also ginger or ATF. These plants are tenacious, they grow quickly, they get spread by introduced ungulates, and they convert what would have been a beautiful native forest into a impenetrable mass of non-natives. And they are definitely an existential threat to birds in key areas where you might have had a slope covered in aluhe, and now you've got a slope covered in guava, and those birds are not going to use those sites anymore. And they require a lot of time and effort to deal with them just on their own. There are many ways of dealing with it, but they're all backbreaking. But controlling in these introduced plants and then restoring the habitat with native forest is absolutely key. And in these areas where the introduced plants are just starting to get a toehold in, like guava, they should be removed instantaneously because once they get stuck in there, then it gets harder and harder to remove them. So introduced plants are definitely a key part of management. And if they're ignored, then it doesn't matter. All the predator control work you do could be in vain if there's nowhere left for the birds to nest in. That's why somewhere like Upper Limahuli is a really important site, because that, traditionally the focus has been on plant management. And native plant protection, and you can really see it in places like that. And Honolulu Natural Area Reserve, they are predominantly native forest, but keeping on top of these introduced plant species is fundamental. And then lastly, just to talk quickly about marine distribution, Kavika, that was something that you brought up about, do the birds use the same areas at sea? The answer is no. The mules, and this will be, firstly, they're feeding on different things. They have different ways of feeding. Like the mules is a species which is capable of diving down to 50 meters in pursuit of its prey, whereas the Hawaiian Petrol is more going for squid and flying fish on the surface that are being driven up by tuna. And so they have different foraging techniques, but they're also foraging in different areas. And you can see here, these are all mules that were tracked from Upper Limahuli. They're basically feeding within 140 kilometers of the north of Kauai, this particular colony. Whereas Hawaiian Petrols, which were also tagged in the same area, and everyone who works with Hawaiian Petrols knows these sort of routes that these birds take, but I always think they're amazing journeys to look at on a map. They do these huge looping, like multi-week journeys just to feed their chicks. You get one bird that's doing this sort of like 14-20 day journey, and then the other one that's doing a shorter journey in these kind of areas. But it's a lot of time investment for them to get the food for their chicks and bring it back. So they definitely feed in different areas. And wintering is also something that we've been looking at. These are fledglings, Newell shearwater fledglings over time. Some of them are SOS birds, some of them are wild birds. But you can see they're all doing the exact same thing year after year. They all go 2,500 kilometers to southwest to this area right here, which is a really important convergence zone for a range of different currents and countercurrents. So this is, if you're thinking about conservation of these birds outside of the islands, then you've got to think about the threats that would face them in these areas of ocean, which all these birds are going to. And if something catastrophic happens in this area, you're basically wiping out that year's clutch of birds that have headed down there, because they're all going there. The Hawaiian Petrol is another one that we've been tracking over the years, and they do absolutely incredible journeys from Kauai. They head down to the same general area that the Newells did, but then they track onwards and they end up in the Philippines. This bird here went to the Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, South China Sea. It's a pretty incredible journey for a little bird, this little chappie here, which had never flown before it left its burrow. And it's just this incredibly awesome journey out into this area. But this information is really key when you think about these threats at sea, and they are seabirds. We know there's plenty of threats for seabirds. The threats at sea have been well studied for many species around the world, but they include things like oil rigs, overfishing, bycatch, the horrors of plastic and marine pollution, of which the Great Garbage Patch is well known. I often think about, for example, the squid fisheries off places like Korea with these amazingly bright lights that are just hammering the squid populations in these areas. Like, if all of our Hawaiian Petrols are going to these particular areas where this is occurring, then what's happening to them out there? It can't be good. And one of the birds that we tracked 2 years ago to the Philippines ended up transmitting on land for a couple of months near a village. So my feeling is that bird got caught and ended up, the tag ended up with a fisherman somewhere. So this is like a kind of a black box in a way. And the first step is understanding where they're going, but then thinking about these threats at sea is kind of like, it's part of the whole in terms of the conservation of the species. And last but certainly not least, I just wanted to quickly mention the Vanderump Storm Petrel. It is one that, all that work that I've been talking about is not really focused on, apart from the Hanapu fence site, for example. But they are a kind of the forgotten bird. And they are a really important species. They're endangered and possibly, who knows, they could even be our own species. They're really, really hard to study. You can't track them really because the tags are too heavy. They're in really inaccessible places. But we have on Kauai figured out at least their breeding distribution. This is a paper that came out in Marine Ornithology based on auditory surveys and song meters. And what you can see here is that this is where they are. They're on Kauai. They're in this sort of mainly this the Nepali coast area. And these areas are pretty cool when you survey them at night, as well as this cacophony of Newell shearwater calls. You get a lot of Hawaiian Petrol calling going on here too. And there's a couple of sites there, which for that genetic study, which I alluded to in that the second slide, we caught 45 storm petrels in 2 hours at one site just there. So there's a lot of storm petrel activity on these cliffs, but it's kind of one of those things where you sit there woefully staring a couple thousand feet up the cliff face thinking, I know you're there, but I can't monitor you. I can't get to your burrow, but I can monitor you with saw meters. And the other area where we do, there's also Waimea Canyon is an important area for the storm petrel too. And then although this predicted occurrence map doesn't show it, there are, in this map here, there are a couple of little pockets like I was talking about where there are small pockets of storm petrels in these larger valleys of Wainiha, Lumahai, and Hanalei, where they're just on these sort of cliff faces, these little patchy cliff faces. They're also on Lehua, which is great news if you think that Lehua is now rat-free. These 3 song meters year after year after year pick up storm petrel activity, and survey work up here. If you do surveys anytime during the peak breeding season for storm petrel, you'll actually see them flying around, which has been a source of aggravation for me because I've watched them flying around and coming close to landing, but you just can never find a burrow of them. But anyway, they're there for sure. They're calling all breeding season. And the threats that they face, this is kind of a classic, at least for Kauai, storm petrel habitat. You can see why we can't get to them. They're like in these areas here. But they do, there are a bunch of threats that still face these birds. They're small. Even if they're on a cliff, even if they're here where a cat can't get to them, you can rest assured that a rat's going to be able to get to them. And a rat will be able to eat not just the eggs, but also the adults. Barn owls most certainly going to be able to get to them. And then light has to be an issue for them because they're extremely attracted to lights. If you ever work in the colonies with storm petrels in, you put your headlight on, the birds are gonna fly into your headlight. And then Powerline collisions, poorly known. Probably a small number of birds are hitting power lines as well. The problem with them, these birds, is though that they're so small and unrecognizable that it's even harder to understand what's happening to them than it is with Newells and Hawaiian Petrols. And solutions would be things like, for example, social attraction and predatory fences like this one. Or island refugia like Maka'aiai, for example. It's probably rat-free and has space for storm petrels. And then, that awesome news that we all heard just a month ago or less than a month ago that Lehua is rat-free. We've got storm petrels out there, that would be a great place to think about for storm petrel conservation into the future, social attraction and artificial nest boxes and so on. So it's 9:56. Like 4 minutes.
Thanks, Andre. I have a dying question for you. A burning question. Not a dying question. Hopefully it's not a dying question. So, Lindsay's going to be speaking about the Oahu distributions of these birds. I know a bunch of people said, oh, well, those are probably just Kauai birds flying around. But based on what you've presented, especially with those tracking data, doesn't seem like the Kauai birds ever fly to Oahu. So I'm curious about what you think about that hypothesis.
Yeah, I'm sure Lindsay will speak to that. But looking at Lindsay's paper, the activity of those birds, there was, on the song meters activity through the breeding season, indicative of breeding birds actually within the area, a small number of breeding birds. The Kauai birds, they're not going to, well, if you look at the tracks, you have to bear in mind those are breeding adult tracks or fledgling tracks. So the chance of any of those birds ever flying to Oahu would be kind of infinitesimally small, because why would they? But yeah, I would say that if you're getting steady calling on a song meter throughout the breeding season in an area, then that's indicative of breeding behavior rather than passing through. On the flip side, if you look at somewhere like, speaking from a Kauai perspective, or Lehua, areas where birds aren't, you don't get a lot of calling. If you do, you get like a sporadic call. So lehua, for example, with mules, I mean, we've been running saw meters out there for years, and there's only ever been a handful of calls, and those are almost certainly birds flying over, and the tracking shows that birds fly over lehua. If you look at Nepali, you get like 1 or 2 Hawaiian Petrol calls if you're lucky, and so that's just a bird flying over. But if your saw meter is showing constant calling, even if it's a low level of calling, then it suggests, and it's through the known breeding season, then it suggests that there are birds actually on site.
Thank you, Andre.
And that's a little
Andre,
Hawaiian check.
I think Koa got some questions in the chat that he can read to you, and that way you can answer them.
Okay.
Hey, Andre, we had a question from a viewer that says, has there been a demographic analysis of the 2 seabird species populations to understand what level of anthropogenic mortality can be tolerated without causing a long-term decline?
That's a good question. The short answer is no. That at least there hasn't been a study that I'm aware of that has done that yet, but that'd be a good one to do.
Cool, great. We also have Lisa Bale from Goodsill, who would like to provide comments as well. So Lisa, if you're on, please go ahead.
Hi, this is Lisa Bale. I'll waive my comments at this time. I'm reassured that this is not a decision-making meeting and there's not quorum, so these discussions will continue.
Great, thank you, Lisa.
Any other questions from anyone on the Zoom call before we take a break?
Hey, Andre, this is Rogelio. Just had a quick question. Those artificial BSTP boxes, would this be the first year you guys deploy those?
Yeah, they went in a couple of months ago, and they'll be the first year, but there'll be no social attraction until the predator fence is completed. So I would say next year would be the first year where we'll actually be able to see, how they fare.
Okay. I'll definitely talk to you offline. I'll be very interested of trying those out this year at PTA.
Yeah, and the design and location of those boxes mirrors the work I've seen in New Zealand with the New Zealand storm petrel, and those storm petrels were using them. And that's a highly endangered storm petrel. So yeah, I have pretty high hopes for that design and location.
Cool. Thank you.
We can share the designs with you too if you want.
Andre, I just want to commend that you showed us the gains in the chick success based on the predator control that you guys have been doing. Do you feel like you have kind of a standard practice or best practice for the effort that's necessary to achieve those desired outcomes for chick, for fledging success, increased nesting and fledging success? And do you think those are translatable to other sites such as wetland birds or other places where we may have mitigation measures taking place?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the monitoring techniques for understanding reproductive success rate with seabirds in these areas have been refined over the years, and it's kind of a trade-off between funding human power and understanding sign. And the less you visit burrows, the less information you have and the less sure you are of outcome, particularly for deep burrows. So I think, the methodology that is now in place on these sites and the number of visits is kind of it'd be the optimal way of dealing with checks in these particular areas with these particular species, and combined with having a subset of them with cameras too helps kind of finesse that information.
Do you think your grid size and effort, though, are translatable to, say, a wetland environment? So like the amount of traps you have out, the frequency of the checks, that kind of thing?
Well, from a trapping perspective, I guess it's all down to species, like the species that you're interested in and the predators that you're dealing with and the environment. So I don't know, it's an interesting one to think about from a wetland perspective. And obviously the breeding season for seabirds is so much longer, right? And so you have to span that entire season with different parts of the phenology because the birds are doing different things at different times of year. Whereas if you think about a water bird species where they're nesting for shorter periods of time and then the birds are often running around, your methods would be different. And then in terms of predator control, you've got to sort of adapt to the landscape. And I mean, I haven't never actually done predator control myself. I just spent a lot of time talking to the predator control teams. And it's all about adaptation and knowing your landscape and knowing your enemy. And what may work in one area may not work in another, and what may work for one, particularly with cats, what may work for one cat is not going to necessarily work for another. So I think you gotta, the broad methods and monitoring techniques are probably applicable, but then tailoring it to each individual need in terms of area and species is key.
Thank you, Andre. The broad context of my question is I'm really interested in what level of effort is necessary to achieve an equivalent outcome to a mammal-proof fence. And so I'm very intrigued by what kind of levels of control we need to actually get to the levels of success that we want to see. So anyways, that's the broader context of the question. Thank you.
Yeah, and predator-proof fences, I mean, I think you also got to remember that once a predator-proof fence is up, and I'm sure everyone remembers it, but it's not the end of the game, right? Like you got to keep on monitoring, you've got to check for incursions, all the effort that goes into play to remove predators. If you leave it not unmonitored for months, you could end up with a total reinvasion. And so that follow-up monitoring and management is absolutely key. And thinking about it from a funding perspective as well, in terms of like replacement of fences, replacement of sections of fencing, all that's got to go into that kind of analysis.
Do we have any more questions for Andre? If not, then we will take a break until 10:15 when Lindsay will give her talk. And thank you very much, Andre, for your presentation.
No problem. Good to talk to you all.
So during the break, don't close Zoom, just mute yourself and walk away if you want, and we will come back at 10:15.
And sorry, Kate, I may have to step out for a bit, but I'll try to keep popping back in.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Our next two talks are going to be Lindsay Young. The first one is going to be an update on the status of fencing projects in Kauai. And the second one is on the Seabird surveys that she's conducted. I do want to make sure that we have time at the end of each one for questions. So if you have questions on one talk, make sure I will interrupt, or Lindsay can allow some time for that at the end of her talk before launching into the next one. And we'll also read out any questions that come in on the chat. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Our next two talks are going to be Lindsay Young. The first one is going to be an update on the status of fencing projects in Kauai. And the second one is on the Seabird surveys that she's conducted. I do want to make sure that we
Hi, Lindsay. I think you have the YouTube audio going on in the background.
I will interrupt her, Lindsay, please.
Okay, great.
I'm actually not able to hear anything on my end, Koa. Can you let me know when I'm good to go?
Yep, we can hear you fine.
Okay. Is everyone ready?
Yep, go ahead.
Sorry, we're having a little bit of technical difficulties on my end. So thank you for inviting me to come today. My name is Lindsay Young. I'm the Executive Director of Pacific Rim Conservation, and we are a nonprofit group that works across the state of Hawaii and really across the Pacific on endangered and threatened bird issues. And so I'm going to be giving two talks. One are on planned and upcoming, current and upcoming Kauai seabird fences, and then the other is going to be on statewide surveys for listed seabirds. So just to introduce what type of fencing we're talking about, there are ungulate fences and regular sort of hog wire fences that are meant to keep out ungulates, and then there are predator exclusion fences. So I'm going to be focusing exclusively on predator exclusion fencing. And so what these are fences that are tall enough that animals cannot jump over them. And as you can see on the left, and apologies that this is in metric, but that's how scientific world works. They are 2 meters or about 6.5 feet tall. They have a rolled hood that you can see here that animals cannot climb over, and the height makes it so that they can't jump over. And then what is affixed between the posts, and it's actually kind of tough to see down here, is a fine woven mesh. It's kind of like a mini chain link fence, and the mesh is small enough that animals as small as 2-day-old mice can't actually squeeze through. And then the final part of this is a skirt that is laid just underground, about 30 centimeters or a foot, so that digging animals can't dig under it. And so the combination of these features makes it so that it is essentially impermeable to any of our mammalian pests in Hawaii. So cats, dogs, rats, mice, mongoose, pigs, deer, all of it. It keeps out all animals except for barn owls. So there is still a flighted predator that can get in, but the combination of these things makes it so that you can keep out one of the largest threats to seabirds, which you just learned about in the previous presentation. And so these fences started being used in Hawaii in 2011 on Oahu at Kaena Point. And we have multiple fences that we've put up on the island of Oahu, but Kauai has been a few years behind. And so the hard part about this is there's lots of conservation work that's going on across the landscape on Kauai, but it's not necessarily done with all of the same partners or all of the same agencies, even though it's benefiting the same species. And so the point of this is to put it into a larger context of where all these fences are and what the purpose of them is. So this is a map, the best I could do to capture all of the planned and existing fences on Kauai. So yellow means that they are actively in construction or completed. Orange means they will be under construction by the end of the year. And then red means they're in the planning phases. So if we go from left to right, a little bit hard to see, this is the outline of the Honopu fence, and I'll talk about each of these individually. This triangle here is the Kuhuama'a fence as part of the KSHCP, which everyone on this committee is relatively familiar with. This little yellow dot right here is the Pohakea fence. And then these two large ones, these two large red outlines here, this is the Upper Limahuli Preserve fence and Upper Minoa fence, which are in the sort of conceptual and planning phases right now. And then if we go all the way over to our right-hand side, we have two fences here. One is the Nihoku fence, so this little yellow circle right here. This fence was the site of translocations for the last 5 years. And then the orange is actually a planned one for the entire perimeter of Kilauea Point National Wildlife Refuge. So that is going to break ground later this year. So as you can see, we have 7 fences planned or currently in progress on the island of Kauai. So if you're looking at all of these, this is the North Shore of Kauai for those that aren't familiar. I'm kind of confused as to who owns this or what these are all for. I'm going to walk you through all of that. So this is a summary of everything that's going on, and it's sort of sorted by the status of the project. So the first fence was the Nihoku fence. This was done as essentially mitigation as a translocation site for Hawaiian Petrols and Newell Shearwaters. So it was completed in 2014, and from 2015 to 2020, active translocations of Newell Shearwaters and Hawaiian Petrols occurred at that site. So the whole purpose of this was to start a new colony where a colony did not currently exist. So the purpose being translocation. Chicks were actively moved into that area, hand raised until they fledged. And so the status of that fence is that we have birds that are returning. We have pairs of Hawaiian Petrols on the ground. We're hoping that on our nest check, which is, I believe, tomorrow, we might have our very first egg, but we don't quite know yet. But regardless, we do have birds that have been translocated that have returned to the site as adults. And so that project is kind of moving into the next phase where we monitor for the outcomes. The second two, and I'm going to kind of present them together because there's a lot of similarities, are Pohakea and Hanapu. So again, looking at essentially these first 3 fences, you can see the sizes of them are smaller. They're 6 acres, 3 acres, and 3 acres. Funding sources are similar and purposes are similar. So Pohakea and Hanapu are both social attraction sites, and they are both currently under construction. I'm going to show pictures and some more detailed maps of all of these in a little bit. Kahuama'a, which is the KSHCP site, is just under 3,000 feet, encompasses about 9 acres, and is mitigation. It is also a social attraction site, and it is under construction, expected to be completed next week, actually. Kilauea Point fence is much larger, 10,500 feet, encompassing about 250 acres. And so if you're looking at this, or maybe you're not looking at this, but if you're wondering why there's so many discrepancies between the length and then the area, it depends on whether you have a peninsula style fence with open ends versus a complete circular enclosure. And the reason why Kilauea Point is capturing so much area relative to the length of the fence is because it's a peninsula style fence, which I'll get into when we talk about that one specifically. So the funder for this one, this was an invasive species grant to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service from a national program. And the whole purpose is to eradicate predators from the entire refuge to benefit all species. But as you just heard, we have Hawaiian petrels that are very close to being nesting in the area, and they do have existing colonies of Newell shearwaters. So while this fence wasn't explicitly for listed seabirds, it was a bit more of an ecosystem level approach, it still benefits them. Whereas every other fence on this list is exclusively for listed seabirds. So construction for that fence starts in fall 2021. We have all the materials staged and the fence line cleared, and it is kind of ready to go. And then the 2 other projects, which are sort of in the conceptual / permitting stage right now, are Upper Limahuli and Upper Minoa Valleys, the 2 adjacent fences that I showed you. Those are hoping to be mitigation sites for KIUC under an HCP. And those 2 have 2 different purposes. So when I'm talking about the purpose being in situ versus social attraction, in situ means it's protecting an existing colony of species of the birds. Versus social attraction, that means that the hope is to draw them in through the use of speakers and decoys, which I will talk about in a bit. So that's kind of the large scale picture that I want you to have of all these fences as I walk through each one individually. Okay, so going to just take a look at more of the northeastern side of the island. And the reason why I wanted to zoom in on this was to look at the proximity between everything. And unfortunately, my line is not showing up here, but there was a line that was drawn between all of these. Basically, the Upper Limahuli, Upper Minoa, Pohakea, KSHCP, and Hanapu fences are all within 25 kilometers of each other. So they're all in a relatively small area. Whereas when we zoom out, Kilauea Point is much more on the right-hand side of this picture. So we'll start with Hanapu. This one is actively under construction. You can see the aerial photograph when the line was cleared, going around this knoll. This is what the fence line looks like. And there are birds nesting very nearby, unfortunately, just outside of the fence itself. So this is going to be a social attraction site. Fence construction has started, artificial burrows have been installed, and we are hopeful that this will be completed by the end of the year. And so you can see the topography that's going on here is super challenging to work in. You're also probably noticing like that is a large scar on the landscape. So one of the features of predator fences is that you have to have them put in enough so that a cat can't climb up a tree or jump from a boulder and get over the fence. What that means is if your fence is going to be right here, you have to have a cleared area to make sure there's no jumping off points for animals. And that's why you have so much more of a footprint with these compared to a traditional ungulate fence. Pohakea is well underway, and you can see sort of the aerial view in Google Earth of what that looks like, as well as the aerial view from the helicopter of what that fence line looks like. This one, even though it is the smallest of all of the fences, has been the most technically challenging, and that is because it is helicopter access only. And so having to rely exclusively on helicopters for both gear as well as human transport has been challenging, especially with the amount of rain. But that fence is looking good and also clear to be done by the end of this year. So Nihoku and Kilauea Point, these are on the far kind of northeastern side of the island. And as you can see, they encompass each other. So the new boundary fence, which is this kind of blue line here, is going to replace the existing hog wire fence at Kilauea Point with a predator exclusion fence. And this is actually peninsula style. So you'll notice there is an open end over here. There's also going to be an open end that's not quite pictured kind of on the other side of this cliff. And so we're relying on these cliff edges for the boundary fence, which follows right down in here, to provide secure points for ingress, primarily against cats. We're hoping that this will be highly effective against rats, but with an area this size, there's not a guarantee. So the main target species is actually cats and other larger animals. But what it means is that it has a lot more of an area. So 250 acres as opposed to Nihoku, which you can see here within that, which is about 6 acres. So Nihoku is a full enclosure fence, which is much more secure. There's no ingress points for predators in these areas, makes it a lot easier to keep them out, but it's also quite a bit more expensive and in some cases less feasible. So part of the justification for doing a peninsula style fence for the refuge is, as you can see with the topography, it's going to be really difficult to build a boundary along all of these cliff edges without compromising the structure of the fence, as well as potentially providing a collision hazard for the bird. So it was decided to not build essentially an enclosure on that sea-facing end. Okay, and Upper Limahuli and Upper Minoa, these are two adjacent fence sites. You can see Upper Limahuli right here, Upper Minoa on the right, and these are from the assessment we did in 2014 for these fence sites. Upper Limahuli is home to a thriving colony, both of Newell's shearwaters and Hawaiian Petrol, so it's protecting a really important in situ population of those species. My understanding is there are some birds in Upper Minoa, but not as many, so that is functionally going to be a social attraction site. So what I want to get into now is what this means when we're building fences for social attraction, translocation versus in situ protection. So in situ means you're protecting existing colonies. And the important thing that I really want to emphasize is without these colonies, there are no sources to draw birds from for either translocation or social attraction. In social attraction, you're creating a new colony by attracting birds from nearby colonies to nest in that new location. So if you don't have anywhere to draw them from, you're not going to be able to create these new colonies. And so social attraction and translocation are entirely dependent on having protected in situ colonies. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to predator fence every single in situ colony. You physically cannot do that. The topography doesn't lend itself to that. But it does mean that you have to have healthy, either stable or increasing populations to act as sources of birds. And so we want to make sure, I'm going to go all the way back to this first slide here. You'll notice that we have a lot of colonies that fit into the social attraction and translocation side of things. And the only two real in situ colonies are Kilauea Point and Upper Limahuli. Kilauea Point does not have very many nesting Newell shearwaters. There are less than 10 pairs at that colony. So really the only fully protected colony that will be an in situ protection is Upper Limahuli. And I point that out because it will likely act as the source for colonies like Upper Minoa or fences like Upper Minoa, as well as the other ones going in. So let's look at what social traction actually is for these species. So most seabirds are colonial nesters. This is for a variety of reasons. I won't get fully into the biology, but they think it provides some level of protection against predators in places where they evolved with them, but mainly for information exchange and being able to find a mate. So being able to communicate where suitable habitat is to breed, where suitable forage areas are, there's sort of a community hypothesis that goes behind why they're colonial. And what this means is that you can use those cues that mimic a large colony to draw birds in. And the two cues are acoustic. And what you see here, I mean, it looks like just a mess of stuff, but you've got a solar panel. This is an MP3 player and an inverter in a pelican case. And then you've got a speaker, and this broadcasts their calls straight out into the ocean. And so it tells the birds, you know, the playback of these calls, like, hey, there's a large colony there. And then for species that are more visually oriented, that are not necessarily burrow nesters, but surface nesters, we use artificial decoys. Same sort of concept that hunters have used for a long time with ducks and other water birds, but to use a visual attraction to bring them back in. So social attraction is relying on those natural colonial instincts to bring birds into an area. So a really neat paper that I wanted to bring up, this is by Rachel Buxton from 2016. Whoops. Or is it 2014? Sorry, I can't see that very bottom bit on my screen here. And New Zealand developed a decision framework for seabird restoration. And this was primarily to guide managers. After their offshore islands, they did a lot of eradications and they wanted to know how to proceed. So do we do passive restoration? Do we do active restoration? Do we even need to do restoration? And so they did a full analysis of all of the different factors that go into this. And so, you know, they start with the context of ecological, social and cultural, as well as economic and political. So all of the things that go into making a decision for the management of the species, and then what the goals are, both in the short term and the long term. And then finally coming up with a project design. So whether it is passive, and they generally take this to be as just eradicate the predators, hope the birds come back on their own. And this would be the same as building an in situ predator exclusion fence, or do they want to take an active approach? And an active approach in this case means translocation, social attraction, or artificial burrow supplementation. So basically all of the activities that we're talking about. And they prioritize those activities based on what they think the outcomes will be, as well as their ability to both implement as well as monitor. And I want to bring up the monitoring component because that's something that's often overlooked when you're thinking about these fences. You can put a fence up, you can get rid of the predators, but if you're not doing long-term monitoring on them, to monitor the fence, to monitor the response of the ecosystem, to monitor for incursions, the efficacy or the investment in many cases is greatly diminished. So having that long-term monitoring is super important. Okay, and so this is a sort of model within that model on whether or not natural recovery will happen following a predator eradication. And so this went into their decision of, do we just let it go and hope birds are going to colonize naturally, or do we have to supplement it with that active translocation? And the take home from this that I want to point out is source population distance, source population size, and source population trend. They found that those were the factors that were going to influence the success of their active social attraction and translocation projects, and therefore the success of them. And if we remember that the number of fences being built on Kauai are mainly geared towards social attraction, these particular questions are really important to determine what the long-term success of that is. And again, this all comes from Buxton et al. 2016. That paper is readily available online. So distance to source colonies. The main determinant of success is recruitment, which means nesting at the attraction site. So even if we have birds visiting on the ground, as in the case of Nihokus, we've got Hawaiian Petrols in the burrows, which is fantastic. But until they actually lay an egg and until we have a bird breeding there, we haven't truly met our objectives for success because we don't have a colony yet. We have the first steps towards that, but we don't actually have birds breeding on the ground. The probability of nesting decreases exponentially with distance from the source colony. And what this means is the further away you are from a good source colony, the less likely you are to have birds colonize your site. And what they actually found is that recolonization for prosolarid species, so shearwaters and petrels, is unlikely unless the colony is within 25 kilometers. And so that's why I pointed out that 25-kilometer distance between all of those fences on the upper plateau of Kauai. So there's a double-edged sword here. So the good news is a lot of the colonies that are doing social attraction within Kauai are within 25 kilometers of existing colonies, and that's what you want. So you have a source to draw from. The double-edged part of it is that we're now all drawing from the same source because they're all within 25 kilometers of each other. So New Zealand Department of Conservation has a pretty interesting model for all of this that we found out almost incidentally, because the sound systems that we use for acoustic attraction, we started ordering through New Zealand, and they ordered them through an electronic shop in their Department of Conservation. And what that means is you have to go through the Department of Conservation permitting checklist for whether or not you're authorized to do social attraction. So we went through this document with them, and it was fascinating because they will not allow you to purchase a sound system if you're doing social attraction within 100 kilometers of another social attraction site. So they've determined that if you do that, you're actually drawing birds from the same source population and diminishing the value of any one project. So I bring this up because our sites are within 25 kilometers of each other. And I think that that is important to factor into the decision-making of doing any future predator fences in that area. That they are going to be drawing from the same source population, and it means that any number of birds going into any one fence is going to decrease the larger the number of fences we have.
Lindsay, one quick question. The existing colonies, not the new ones within the new predator constructed fences, but are they at carrying capacity?
Are the new colonies with
are the existing colonies at carrying capacity, meaning the birds that fledge need a safe place to go?
Andre's probably better poised to answer this, but I would say absolutely not. I mean, we know that we have a species that has declined by 94 and 76% in the last 20 years, and that suggests that they are nowhere near carrying capacity. So I don't think they're habitat limited, they are safe habitat limited. They need areas where they're not being predated on. It's not an availability of burrows issue, if that makes sense.
It does, thank you.
Okay, so the other determinant is source colony size. So I know these aren't shearwaters or petrels, but this is a nice illustration of a colony that probably is at carrying capacity, and this is Midway Atoll, where you have birds nesting just all over the place, and there's competition for nest sites, and it's clearly visible in that photograph. So seabird colony growth is regulated by positive and negative density dependence. Positive meaning birds, the more birds you have, the more birds you're going to attract. And so Midway is a highly attractive environment because of that social hypothesis that they are using the cues from conspecifics to draw them in. And so it's kind of like if you are passing two restaurants in a street and you see one that's got a line out the door and one that's totally empty. I mean, even though it sounds counterintuitive, most people will go to the place with the line out the door because you know that the food is going to be better. There's got to be a reason why everyone's willing to wait in line for that food. And it's kind of the same thing with seabirds. So the more birds you have, the more you attract. But then comes the negative density dependence, where that you get crowding at these higher densities. So it's kind of the interplay between these two where you reach carrying capacity. So the good news is they modeled all of this, and they found that recovery is most likely to happen in a mid-sized remnant colony of 25 to 100 breeding pairs, which is what we'd expect a lot of these colonies to be on Kauai. So sort of a low to medium size remnant colony. So we've got the ideal distance between source colonies. We've got the ideal source colony size to do social attraction on the island. We've just maybe got too many locations that are relying solely on social attraction to create these new colonies. So that is all I have for the fence component of this presentation, and I want to take time to pause to see if there are any questions.
This is Loyal. Lindsay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I just put a question up in the chat, but so with respect to the 100-kilometer issue, it seems to me that may not be as much of a problem for us, since we don't have very many quote unquote really protected colonies, and a lot of the other colonies are ones that are probably not protected and may continue to decline and be lost. And if we're drawing birds from those, that would be a good thing. So I'm not sure we're in the same boat as New Zealand.
I think that if you have two sites that are really close together, that you're going to be drawing from the same location. And I don't think any of the sites that we have planned right now or that are under construction are going to be reaching carrying capacity anytime soon. So I think it's wiser to put investment into doing either predator control or protection of in situ colonies rather than creating more social attraction sites than we have right now. So I'm not advocating for stopping what we have now. What I'm saying is I think that we are at a good space in terms of the number that are being put in across Hawaii for social attraction. And I think future efforts should focus on fencing existing colonies and making sure we get those protected. If it's not fencing, then doing predator control to make sure that we have adequate sources for all of them. Because ideally, you don't want to wait until a colony is blinking out to just draw the birds in. You want that to be a healthy, sustaining colony. Because even with social attraction, it takes anywhere from 2 years if you're super, super lucky, but more likely 5 to 8 to really get a colony going. And with the rate of decline these guys have had, you know, the 90-something and 70-something% in a 20-year period, I'm just worried that we're going to run out of birds to actually create these new colonies with.
I had a comment just to add that the source for the Nihoku seabirds was Hononopali Natural Area Reserve, which is not completely fenced, but has a high level of predator control happening and some ungulate fence exclusions. So to say that Pohakea is a social attraction site, I think that's true, but it's surrounded by fairly intact, nice habitat that to me acts as though it's an in situ location for seabirds. So I feel like there's two things going on, and I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, I'm using more of a strict definition of the fence is actually enclosing nesting birds. And so I agree that Pohakea is excellent habitat and there are lots of birds nearby. There might be 1 or 2 pairs within that fence. I don't know yet this year, but just pointing out that that fence is not by the definition protecting an existing colony. It might be within a larger colony, but it's not encompassing burrows itself.
Right, but the area around it is.
Yes.
Not fenced, but it's certainly acting as an in situ location for existing seabirds, so much that it was used as the source to move seabirds to Nihoku.
Correct. And that's because it's got great predator management going on. It's not to say, and that was kind of to the earlier point, is not everywhere is going to be fenceable. It's pretty tough to put these things up in that terrain. But doing some kind of management against predators to make sure they've got a stable or increasing population is super important, whether that's fencing or predator control.
Right.
Lindsay, I have kind of a big picture question. Predator-proof fences. Okay, so one of the things on your decision analysis slide, which was, it's great to pull that in. I love thinking about those things. When we think about the short term versus the long term, predator-proof fences are a stopgap measure to make sure that we don't continue bleeding populations and that we can keep enough around that we can recover them into the future. But long term, landscape scale predator control seems to be needed, especially when we look at the size of those mammal-proof fences, because they're not predator-proof, right? But mammal-proof fences compared to the entire landscape where seabirds would have been in the past. Can you just briefly speak to the investment and the thinking that might need to happen for doing these short-term stopgap solutions versus long-term recovery goals?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question. So predator fences, what we've been told to expect is a 30-year lifespan. And I say what we've been told is because we're not 30 years into this experiment yet. So we really don't know the answer to that, but we can expect them to have a lifespan of 30 years. And so it's hoped that at the end of that 30 years, you have a thriving colony within the fenced area, and you either, replace the fence or still manage it as a predator-free area, or revert to predator control to manage it and have it be a source. But the whole idea is these protected areas act as a source that in the future, they can then seed areas outside. And the hope is that there will be landscape level control available at that time point so that those animals acting as the source and the seed for all of those, the new colonies outside the fence will be protected. So we're almost reversing the order of things. If everything goes as planned and we have tools that come online that allow us to do this at more of a landscape or island-wide scale.
Sorry, just one brief follow-up on that. I think with the things that are happening, particularly on Kauai with our forest birds right now, this whole thing of a 30-year time horizon, I think can go by really, really fast. And all of a sudden that 30 years is up and we haven't done the policy work and the legwork that needs to be done to actually be at that point. And so 30 years can feel super safe because, hey, majority of us maybe would be retired by then or whatever. I don't think I'm set for retirement by then the way it goes, but anyways, you know, a lot of people will be. And so it's just a safe thing in the future. What kinds of steps do we need to be taking now? So I know you've jumped through a lot of regulatory hurdles just to get to where you're at with the translocations and everything else. So I think you're a good person to speak to this. What kinds of things do we need to be doing now and pacing ourselves out so we're actually ready for that 30 years from now?
So I think a good first step is consolidating all of the people that work on these species statewide, which this is doing today, meeting more frequently with the Seabird Hui so that there's more coordination and everybody knows about the different projects that are happening. But I think actually designating a point person who is in charge of driving that mission. I mean, there's a recovery plan from 1987 for these species, and we're just starting not even to hit the milestones, but to hit the activities that are required to meet the milestones. And that's, you know, 1987 was a while ago at this point. So I think really having one person that is tasked with herding the cats for that and implementing that vision. And if we're going to have landscape level control, we need to break that down by species and figure out what species need what activities to achieve landscape level control, whether it's some sort of toxicant or manual control or what that may look like. But we do need to start planning for that, because I agree, it comes up quickly.
Thank you, Lindsay. And I just want to make sure and make a note of, for the record, I think that's something that really needs to be initiated sooner rather than later. And I'm not sure who the people are that are on this call that could put a word in with hiring a person who is specifically in charge of leading such an effort and doing that planning. But as we've seen with the 30 by 30 plans and other things like that, these really large efforts take dedicated personnel that aren't trying to juggle 20 million other things. So thank you again for speaking to that. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So Lindsay, this is Fern. I had a question. I was just wondering, for social attraction sites in predator-free areas, are you aware of that sort of development where they do not incorporate like artificial nesting boxes or other things? Is there any comparison between creating a safe area, doing social attraction, and not having artificial burrows, just to see if there's a real difference in, you know, presenting artificial burrows to help stabilize and get social attraction going better than if it's not present? I was just wondering, is there any literature that you're aware of that actually has looked at site differences that way?
No, I'm not aware of it, but that's a really good question. And there's kind of two parts to that. So when we started looking at doing all these fences, spent several weeks in New Zealand visiting, or I've done this like 3 different times now, visiting all the fence projects. And in general, in New Zealand, the artificial burrows are put in to facilitate monitoring of the birds and not necessarily as the nesting location, at least at the sites that we visited. And so they have a slightly different purpose than what we're describing here. But I don't know if anyone has actually looked at, you know, recruitment at a site that's got burrows versus doesn't have burrows. I will say, and this is, you know, we haven't announced it publicly, but at James Campbell National Wildlife Refuge, we now have multiple bone-in petrels that have returned and are breeding as adults that were translocated to the site, and half chose to nest in the artificial burrows and half just dug natural burrows. And they both have chicks. So I'm not sure that the burrows necessarily make a difference unless the area and the habitat inside of the fenced area is somehow compromised and undergoing restoration and they're limited in habitat. My understanding was the objective initially when this was, you know, developed decades ago was so that you could just get in there easily and see what you were working with. It was for the people.
Okay, thank you.
But that, for anyone who's on the line and has grad students that may want a project, that sounds like an excellent project, Melissa. No, that would be really interesting because artificial burrows are a lot of work and they do require a footprint on the landscape. And if it's just so that we can put our arms in more easily, I think that there are better ways that we can monitor burrows without necessarily putting in a lot of man-made stuff. Because artificial burrows come with their own level of risk. There is flooding, there are temperature extremes, and each site has to have essentially things that are custom tailored to that individual site, as well as post-installation monitoring to make sure that they are suitable for the species that they're going in. So anytime you introduce a man-made structure into the habitat, you also introduce risk.
Yeah, I was just wondering, especially for like Makamaka Ole sites, that you know, is it something in a way, hopefully you're not imprinting birds to look for that sort of a structure versus being able to create their own, and whether for mitigation purposes, whether presence in a protected area is one thing and nesting there is one thing, or is nesting in boxes that are going to be really important for figuring out mitigation levels?
Right. I think, I mean, that depends on the search effort you're putting into the surrounding area. As long as you're doing adequate searches, not in the burrows, the metric should still be whether birds are nesting, period, not what they're nesting in. And, you know, I hope as time goes on with all of these projects, we'll be able to better answer that in a Hawaii context. But you do have my interest piqued, and I'm going to shoot off some emails to folks in New Zealand to see if they have data on that that maybe hasn't been published.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Lindsay, this is Rogelio. I had a question. So with artificial nests, is there a specific technique where if you did have an isolated burrow, would you put multiple artificial nests around that, hoping that that individual might choose that burrow or another pair would use it? So what strategies would you advise if you're going to start introducing artificial burrows?
I mean, in general, we put the artificial burrows in places primarily that are going to have reduced exposure to sun. That's our first consideration. And then we try and put them in areas where the birds have good takeoff and landing points so that they're easily accessible. And then wherever possible, close to the actual sound system, because that's where most of the birds are going to congregate around. So you want all of that equipment in the same area. If we had a natural burrow, I would actually not put artificial burrows nearby. We want them to nest in natural structures whenever possible. So I would just honestly leave it alone. I mean, we would still monitor it, but we wouldn't put infrastructure next to it. All right, are there any other questions? Okay, I'm just going to quickly switch PowerPoints here.
Sorry, this is Koa. One thing, I think Lisa Bale also wanted to make a comment on this agenda item. She's available.
I'll waive my comments, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Lisa.
Yes, go ahead. Okay, let me just get the second presentation up. One moment. Okay, so what I'm going to be presenting next are statewide surveys that were done in 2016 for all three of our listed seabird species. And so there was a bunch of people that helped with this effort, and I'm going to go through the results of those, and then I'm going to focus on the end towards what happened and what we found on Oahu and what is still ongoing. So there's a lot of people that helped out, and these were all islands except for Kauai, because Kauai has excellent existing data. So if it looks like it's missing an island, that's because it is. So the idea behind this is US Fish and Wildlife came up with a model that incorporated what suitable habitat looked like for these three species statewide. And most of that data came from where they nest on the island of Kauai. And that was extrapolated in various ways with Adam Borsino. So he incorporated precipitation, temperature, vegetation type, as well as light presence, essentially across the state, to come up with a model that predicted where you might expect to find these birds. And so from his model, we then went to go search for where birds might be in that area. And so I'm completely glossing over what was a very complicated and sophisticated model. So if Adam is on here, apologies that I'm probably butchering it. But know that this is part of a publication, and if you're interested in the modeling details, we can go into that. So we're going to start with the island of Molokai, and you're going to start to see how all these models look on the island. So this is the light visibility viewshed on Molokai, compiled from 10 different iterations. And so the warmer colors, basically the red is where you have light pollution, which is, as we all know, not good for birds. Black is where it is fairly dark. So on Molokai, you can see we're not going to expect to find birds in this area, or if we do, they're going to be downed birds. And then all of the different other habitat characteristics, so elevation being a factor, most of the birds found today are at higher elevation. Slope, most of the birds are found nesting on sloped areas. The vegetation model, and then another 2 different types of vegetation go into it. And so all of that, the combination of vegetation, light visibility, elevation, and slope produce what is supposed to be the preferred habitat for all 3 species. And so you can see for Newell's shearwater on the southern area of the island here, and then in some gullies on the north, there is presumed suitable habitat. Hawaiian Petrol, not as much, and same thing with Bandurp Storm Petrel, not as much. And so these were the areas that were narrowed down where we were going to conduct our searches on each island. So I'll go through those for each of the islands. So on Molokai, what we ended up doing is partnering with Jay in the Maui Nui Seabird Recovery Project and deploying song meters in various locations across the island. Some of these were song meters that Jay and his partners had going in, already had going for other projects, and then we combined all of those into suitable areas. You can see most of them are concentrated in the area where there was suitable habitat. So here's a close-up of more of our deployment locations kind of along the upper area of this crater as well as into the north, and almost all of these were aerial deployments. So to give you an idea of what that looks like, so the song meters that were used at the time were SM2 as well as SM4 models, so a little bit bulkier than the ones you're used to seeing today. And a lot of the areas that they were put into were extremely steep vegetated topography. So the areas where, the secondary thing we were assessing is whether these areas were fenceable. And so obviously when you've got stuff that's dropped right onto a cliff, it's not going to be fenceable. But what we found is there was potential to build a fence at the song meter number 8. And so what the hope was that we would detect birds in areas that were also fenceable. So the idea was to prioritize where you could actually protect birds if you found them in that area. So then for Maui, this is what the light visibility viewshed looks like on Maui with the same model parameters that were used. And these were the areas where suitable habitat was determined and song meters were deployed. So we had 3 sites over on West Maui and then sort of 2 in the Haleakala area. Okay, and this is an example sort of habitat in that area. There's obviously a lot steeper habitat that's going on in other locations. And then this was some of the more flatter area. In general, these are actually really nice, intact native forests where these things are being, I'm sorry, I have pet quail that are next to me. So if you're wondering why there's weird bird noises, they're into this presentation. Okay, so on Maui, this is what happened. There were Hawaiian Petrol detections at this site over here and Newell's at these. And so all of the detections that we got on Maui were from West Maui. And of all of those sites, there was one site that was potentially fenceable in those areas. And the neat thing was it was where both species were being detected. We're not sure if these were at a level that would indicate a colony, but as you can see by the number of hits that we were getting where birds were actually there, it's possible that there are birds nesting nearby, if not immediately in that area. And so where Newell's were detected, you can see there are decent call rates kind of throughout the season. So this is, again, date over on the left and the total number of calls. So up to 150 calls in some locations. Where some of those other song meters, you may have had a couple calls, which probably indicates birds are just transiting the area, or in this case, just one call. But this one site, site number 9, right here, had call rates that are indicative of a colony either right in that location or very nearby. Okay, so on to the Big Island. So same thing that you're seeing there before, with the light being areas of habitation. The areas where song meters were deployed were over in the northern Kohalas and then on Mauna Loa south flank. And so this is what it looks like in the northern Kohalas. When you're flying in, you have these large wide valleys, steep cliffs, and then kind of a plateau in the area. And this was the habitat up there. And so it was pretty interesting because this top upper flat area is really quite boggy. It's not really suitable for birds, but then it's interspersed with these nice riparian areas where you have these cliff edges and vegetation that's suitable for nesting, you know, the aluhe and ohia structure. And then on Mauna Loa on the south flank, very, very different habitat. So this was more moonscape style where you've got just lava flows and almost barren rock. And this is also part of the reason why the Hawaiian Petrol and Vanderump Storm Petrel habitat analyses look very different from Newell's. Newell's generally don't nest in this really rocky, barren habitat, whereas Hawaiian Petrols and Vanderumps do, as well as nesting in the vegetated stuff. And so what it does is it kind of skews the habitat representation, or it just makes it look very different between the species. So Hawaii Island call rates. So these are, so at Mauna Loa, I want to start with those very high call rates of Vanderump Storm Petrels in that kind of rocky habitat. So you can see here, this is not just total number of calls, but calls per minute. So up to 2.5 calls per minute of Vanderump Storm Petrel and up to 300 total calls on any given day with Hawaiian Petrel. So basically this area had a really dense Hawaiian Petrel and Vanderump Storm Petrel colony. And we actually physically saw birds when we were there at the time. The Pu'u'oumi site did have detections throughout the time period. And at this point, they looked pretty low, just a few calls here and there. Keep in mind, this is from 2016. And so what happened at 2016 with these island-wide surveys is managers then started to do more regular surveys. I know Alex Wang is on the call and he was part of these original surveys. He has since found many, many more birds at Pu'u'oumi, both in Slant Camp and the Poho Camp, which are the two areas that they were detected. So this initial pass through, these models were able to identify areas and narrow down search areas for us to start looking for birds. And then what's happened since then has varied a bit by island, but it has been super interesting. Okay, so I'm now going to focus on Oahu. So despite being the most inhabited island, and these birds were presumed extinct here for hundreds of years and actually weren't initially included in the funding survey, the Oahu Inferiority Complex with Seabird biologists, we just thought we're going to put out some song meters because they should be included and we live here and it's relatively easy. So even though it wasn't part of the initial study, we asked that the model could be still reproduced for this island and we would give it a shot. So for those that have not had the pleasure of being up in Oahu's mountains, we do have plenty of intact native forest up there. There's just a lot of light pollution. So we put song meters out at 3 different locations, one in Kalihi Valley. So this is where the Like Highway goes through. And there was a man that recorded Newell shearwaters calling above his house repeatedly for months in 2004. So verified calling rates of Newell shearwaters. So Kalihi Valley was selected, Polychaea, and then Mount Kaala. And so what we ended up finding was that there were birds at the Kaala song meter location, and not just Newell's, but also Hawaiian Petrels. So we were actually quite surprised by this. So in 2017, applied for more funding, and since then have been deploying song meters across the island. So all along the Waianae Range here and along the Ko'olau Range. And so what we have found is Hawaiian Petrels are concentrated at Mount Kaala, and this actually is not updated as of last year, as well as areas in the Ko'olaus, which I'll get into in a minute. And what you can see is there's very little projected Hawaiian habitat or Hawaiian Petrel suitable habitat on the island of Oahu. Basically just these really narrow ridgelines up here with a little highlighted area at Mount Kaala. And that's basically because our light view shed looks like this. So Oahu is basically lit up almost all of the time because we do have these large urban centers on the southern side of the island. So there are very, very few areas that are truly dark. And even so, you can still see light from almost any place on the island. So it just meant there was less habitat for Hawaiian Petrels, but a little bit more for Newell's. And so what you can see, there's more suitable habitat along the ridges here. Sorry, it's summertime in my house. Gab, I'm on a meeting. Bye.
Mama, we need a cold snack.
You can find a snack.
Can you help us?
Nope.
Please.
No, Gabby, you're saying hi to like 100 people right now.
Hello.
Please go. Thank you.
Oh, there's
Okay.
21 people.
So there are mules that were detected mainly at Mount Ka'ala and then in multiple places along the Ko'olau Range. So what was interesting is when wind energy facilities were being planned for on the Ko'olau Range, this is taken from the report that was put into, I believe, the Wailoa wind farm. They did find a lot of shearwater-like targets transiting the area, and that was incorporated into that HCP, but Hawaiian Petrols were not. So the calling periods for Newell shearwaters are primarily just before sunrise. So you get most of them in this time period, and there are a few after sunset. Gab, I can't pause. You need to go. Robert can help you.
Can we have frosting?
No, you're not eating frosting. Okay, so the locations of the Newell shearwaters detections across the island of Oahu. So are on Mount Ka'ala over here, and then all throughout the Ko'olaus from the southern end at the Pomoho Cabin, all the way up to Kaluanui. And the cool thing about this is, so there are two parts of this that I really like. First of all, the models that were done were actually highly predictive of where we found birds. And so modelers don't often get that real life satisfaction, but in this case, they were actually predictive of where we ended up finding them. The other thing on Oahu that was really satisfying is all of these detections are within natural area reserves. So they're already within areas that are managed for wildlife and for plants. And so they already have some level of protection, which is great. So overall, what we've found since 2016, we've had 66 detections of Hawaiian petrels. 56 of those are at Mount Ka'ala, 9 in Kaluanui, so Waianae versus Ko'olau. Newells, we've had 78 detections, 16 were at Ka'ala, and then 62 spread across those Ko'olau sites. And most of this up to 2019 is available in the existing publication that I've listed below. But one thing that is not, that I kind of want to bring up is how many in-person detections we're getting where we're not actually hearing birds. And so we started doing ground searching last year, and what we found is we actually see these guys relatively often when we're there at night. And we can't always assign it to a species, that's what the unknown means, but we are able to see them, and often they're not calling. So we know that the birds are transiting, and it means that our auditory detections are probably underestimating by quite a bit what is actually there. And the other interesting thing that came out of this was the impact of man-made noise on these birds. So at Mount Ka'ala, when we first sent in our acoustic surveys to be analyzed by conservation metrics, they asked us to move the song meter because there was this hum being emitted right down here at this tonal frequency that was interfering completely with the first note of Hawaiian Petrol call. So their model was giving us all of these false positives. And what we realized is the Ka'ala radome, the hum emitted from that equipment is exactly the same frequency as the first tonal note of a Hawaiian Petrol call. And so Mount Ka'ala radome is functionally acting like an acoustic attraction site for Hawaiian petrels. And there's evidence of this in other petrel species where man-made noise actually attracts them to the site. The other thing, and this was taken 2 nights ago, is that Mount Ka'ala is super bright at night. It is very lit up. So on top of having the acoustic attraction, you have the visual attraction of light. So at Mount Ka'ala specifically, we've had 86 detections of listed seabirds since 2016. Most of those are Hawaiian petrels. They're likely attracted to both the light and the sound. And we have ground calling of the Hawaiian petrels as of last week at the site, and that were also heard in 2018. So we know the birds are there. The amount of activity that we're seeing is indicative of breeding, and there's likely things that are going on at the site. Currently, it is not monitored for downed birds, and I think that's something that needs to be addressed and should be approached with the tower that is up there. Because as you can see, it's really bright. This was taken without any kind of flash or anything like that. And the other thing I want to point out is this actually has potential for attraction to wind farms. So this is the area in the Ko'olaus where we're detecting the most of both of these species. And you can see that their access to the ocean here, they fly through all of these turbines. And the reason why I say potential for attraction is I think at certain frequencies when these turbines are spinning, they're also emitting noises that are comparable to the calls of both of these species. Because the amount of take that is happening of Hawaiian petrels and other petrel species specifically on Oahu, is much, much more than you'd expect based on the population. And so there might actually be an attractive factor depending on the frequency of the turbine. And the good news about that is you can dampen sound. So if that's actually what's happening, if they are attracted to these things, there are ways to actually mitigate that might reduce the take dramatically. So something to think about and something I'd like to do more research on. So we're actively trying to put song meters under those turbines to see what frequency they spin at that potentially overlaps with the calls of these species. Okay, so in summary, across all the islands when we did these are the number of sites that were visited on foot, number of sites that were visited aerially, and the number of potentially fenceable sites where seabirds were found on 4 islands and the effort put in. So we visited 18 sites on foot on Oahu and deployed 18 different song meters, and 12 of those 18 sites we detected seabirds, despite, the thought initially was that there were none. On Molokai, we visited 4 sites on foot, 8 aerially, 2 were fenceable, and we detected 1 newel shearwater at one of those sites. Maui, we visited 3 sites on foot, 17 aerially, found 3 sites that were potentially fenceable and deployed 20 song meters, and detected 7 sites with seabirds, 7 Hawaiian Petrols and 2 newels. And then Hawaii Island, visited 3 sites on foot, 1 was fenceable, and detected all 3 species at 3 of the sites.
Lindsay, is this all data or just 2016?
The Oahu is all data, and then the other islands are 2016. So the conclusions from this are that there actually is plenty of suitable habitat left for these species on all of the islands. The model does not account for predator density, and that's likely the most important factor limiting the distribution of these animals today. And so I think follow-up is needed, particularly for newels. We know that Kauai is their stronghold, but I think there is a lot of potential to find these on other islands, and that noise pollution could be contributing to the distribution patterns, particularly in areas where you have a lot of urban development. So want to thank the partners on this project. It was a large effort in 2016 and continues to be a large effort today, with all the follow-up that we're trying to do to figure out what's going on and how we can protect these guys island-wide. And with that, I am happy to take any questions.
Lindsay, this is really impressive work. And I think what I really appreciate is that you've laid the groundwork for just knowing what is where, which in the past has been an issue when we thought things were extirpated from a particular island and so didn't plan appropriately for species that were in fact left on the island. So I really appreciate the effort that's gone into documenting all of this and also tying it to actions and pathways to move forward with seeing potential sites where we can build fences. I'm curious about, I know that we've done the work on the band from storm petrels for genetic distinctness of the different populations. I was just curious for the other species, has there been any work done where we know what kind of genetic contributions are present in these different populations? Are they distinct? Is there a possibility for, if they have gotten inbred on particularly these very small populations, for mitigating for that? So I'm just curious about the genetic structure of the populations, if that information exists.
Yes, so it does for Hawaiian petrels, less so for newels, just because there's not many populations from other islands. But Hawaiian petrels we know are fairly distinct between each island. And they also have different phenology to a certain extent. So Hawaiian petrels might have incipient speciation going on between the different Hawaiian islands, which is worth considering when we think about management units. And for the birds on Oahu, that's a big question for us. So with the 2 birds that came down on the wind farms, those were actually sent to the Smithsonian for stable isotope as well as genetic analysis to see where they fall out in that tree. And the initial results are that they don't fall out with the other island groups. Because our question was, are these birds coming from other islands? Or are they just, prospecting and attracted in, or is this a remnant population? And at least the preliminary evidence, and it's not done yet, we're still working on it, is that this is a remnant population. So they've been here all along, they're just at very, very low densities. And, if that's the case, that's an even stronger argument for conserving them, because we know Hawaiian petrels in particular have very unique genetic structure, phenology, and even morphological differences between the islands. And so they really are quite different.
Well, Lindsay, I have a related question. In your previous talk, you talked about social attraction, and in this talk, you talked about the light attraction. I want to be sure that I'm understanding what you say when you mean light attraction up at the top of Ka'ala. Are you meaning that it's bringing in prospecting birds, or it's keeping remnant birds, or can you help me to understand?
I think it's, I mean, in the same way that they're attracted to light and fallout, I think it's possibly that the light is attracting them in as well as the sound. So you've got like two reinforcing mechanisms going on there. And I don't say the light's attracting them in this case in a good way necessarily. I think it's likely that there is fallout happening, or it has happened in the past at that facility. I don't know for sure, but I would be surprised if it hasn't, based on, we had 56 calls over a few month period from the same location that was like 200 yards away from that tower. So they're definitely in that very immediate area. And we see them actually flying, past the tower when we're doing the visual surveys at night.
Thank you. And do you know what entity has management purview over that location?
It's both Air Force and FAA. And to make it extra fun, they fly through Schofield area. So they're kind of hitting every single federal entity on their way up there.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that, we have a number of unlisted species on Oahu that we know are highly impacted by the lights on Oahu. And I know, like when we did the lights visit to Kauai and then flew back over to Oahu, and flying in the evening, it was like, oh my goodness, there's so many skyward pointed lights. It's nuts. And there is a lot of fallout associated with that of wedge-tailed shearwaters and other species, but largely wedge-tailed shearwaters. I guess looking across the different islands and the impacts to seabirds, I don't know. Can you just speak to the Oahu issue? Like potentially like needing to turn down the lights to save the remnant population, or, kind of what level of things would need to happen to actually be able to contribute to recovering these populations on Oahu?
Well, oh gosh. I think where they're left is where it's relatively light free. And so we would have to focus, we'd have to know what the flyways are and really put our efforts into refining those, because the reality of Oahu is we're not going to get all these lights turned off. There's not any hope of that. So knowing how they're transiting, where they're going through, and then focusing on those communities. And I also think it's possible that many more birds fall out than are ever recorded, because they're quite literally not on people's radar in the same way that they are on Kauai. And so doing more of a public outreach campaign to let people know, hey, you might have these things down. It's not just, a mongoose or a cat on the side of the road. We don't have the same kind of island awareness of the issue that other islands do. And so I think we have a lower return rate, or not return rate, like turn-in rate to rehab facilities here than we do on other islands. So the combination of those two, but then really focusing on the predator control aspect. I mean, again, the excellent news is that they're being detected in natural area reserves, and those are areas where we can do predator control. And actually, when we do surveys for these guys at night on the ground, we set traps, and we normally catch like a cat and a mongoose every night when we're doing surveys. So as we're entering these areas, we're actively trying to trap to make sure that if we detect them, we're not creating an ingress point for predators.
That's great. Yeah, I think that's important, especially on the Oahu issue. We had done a banding study of shearwater chicks over the last 3-4 years. And so we've now got the fallout data of the band resites. And so we've just submitted a paper for review that's looking at that. And they're falling out a very surprising distance from their colony of origin. It's not, the place they fell out from is not necessarily the nearest point you would expect it to be. So some of them have successfully fledged, made it halfway around the island, or in one case, there was a bird from Oahu that actually fell out on Maui. And so, yeah, there's some pretty surprising distances that they're going. And so for fledging endangered species, I think it's important to keep in mind.
So this, hold on, let me go back a couple slides here. So in the publication that we have out, we actually put all of the different, we have a map in there that includes all the fallout locations that have been recorded for each species on the island of Oahu going back to the 60s. And we tried to overlay that with the maps of suitable habitat for searching. And then we realized the fallout location was associated with the light attraction, not with the habitat. So yeah, we have the same thing. The latest Hawaiian Petrol fallout that was like 2 years ago was in Waikiki. So it's where the lights are. and it's a distance from where you'd find them.
Lindsay, did they do genetics on that bird? I thought they did, but I can't remember.
They have, and they're in the middle of still doing it, and I've been trying to get it back from them. They do have the stable isotope data, and the stable isotope data suggests that they are different, but they're waiting on confirmation on the genetics still. I think because it was being done by Smithsonian, they've been shut down since early 2020 with COVID is the issue.
So the other two birds that you mentioned, those were from wind farms, right? That wasn't the Waikiki
Yep.
bird.
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
So Lindsay, this is Loyal, and I have kind of more of an exploratory question. And it goes back to some of the fencing stuff. So is there a difference between a fence that we put in just to keep cats out versus one that was keeping out cats and rats, the full predator-proof fence? And there would be any instance where you would see where that would be useful to do?
There are differences. The main difference is the material that you use, the mesh on the fence itself. The height has to be the same, and you have to have a hood design, so that doesn't change. And you also still have to have the, wide beard, because that's primarily for cat jumping. So you can still build a cat fence that is less expensive than a full predator fence. The amount of infrastructure and kind of clearing is almost the same. And so you might save a couple $100,000 on the mesh itself, but I think over the long term, you'd actually get that back in terms of benefit if you just excluded rats from the get-go. So it depends. Just because you still have to clear it, it still has to be high, it still has to have a hood on it.
Thank you.
But I do think any effort that can be put into keeping predators out of these colonies, even if it's not a fence, every little bit helps on that end.
Lindsay, this is Rogelio. Similar to the 2016 sort of statewide survey, do you foresee any future surveys that are coming in the future where more people could participate?
Yeah, well, I'd say at this point, each island is kind of doing their own thing and taking off and still following up on these surveys. And so I think contacting the managers on each island that you'd be interested in. So Alex would be your best person, Alex Wang on the Big Island, Jay for Maui, Rachel obviously for Lanai, and we've expanded dramatically and are doing a lot of stuff on Oahu. So we could definitely do that. But yeah, it would just depend on the island. And I think it would be worthwhile repeating these in a couple of years.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, because I know unfortunately PTA was not part of that in 2016, but I know I had song meters running that year. So maybe in the future, I don't know if we could add, I could get permission to see if we could add some of our data to incorporate in the 2016 survey.
Absolutely. And I should have clarified that in some cases where there was actually really good data, we didn't survey there because the whole point was to fill in the gaps where you didn't know what was going on. And PTA does have a relatively comprehensive program there. And that's for the same reason that Kauai was essentially excluded from it, because we do have a lot of data from that island.
Great, thank you, Lindsay. Kate had to step away for a little bit, so are there any more questions? Lisa, did you want to provide comments on this agenda item?
No comments.
Great, thank you. So next on the agenda, we'll have Rachel Sprague from the Na'i, or Sprague from the Na'i present on the seabirds there. So thank you.
All right, let me just get my screen sharing organized. All right, does that look good, Koa?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay. So thank you again for inviting me. And you are seeing not the presenter view, but the regular view, correct?
Yeah, we can see your title slide.
Okay, excellent, thank you. So my name is Rachel Sprague, and I am the Director of Conservation for Pulama Lanai, which is the management company for the major private landowner over here on the island of Lanai, And I should say co-director of conservation. I co-direct with my husband, John, who a couple of you might know. So I do want to start this off by acknowledging multiple people at all of these organizations. There's a formal more acknowledgement slide later on, but these are all essentially almost co-authors in all of the efforts that have gone on and the discoveries and information that I'm going to share with you today. So here we are down here on Lanai, and it is the smallest of the inhabited main Hawaiian Islands, part of Maui County and home to about 3,300 full-time residents. And as you also probably know, Lanai was home to a thriving indigenous community prior to the arrival of Europeans, after which point it has endured several hundred years of invasive species introductions and clearing of native habitat for a variety of agriculture from sugarcane to pineapple. And all of that clearing and those introductions destroyed much of the native dry forest and shrublands. At one point, pineapple was, I believe, using about 35,000 acres under active cultivation of the 90,000 acre island. But even with that, some of the native species remained. This is from Lawrence Harai's surveys in the 1970s, referencing George Monroe, who had believed that the Oahu colony was extirpated in the early 1900s. But in the 70s, he had seen potentially 100 individuals, and both Monroe and Hirai, generally one of their notable observations was wings of birds that appeared to have been killed by cats. So with all of those impacts, we are looking at about 3% of the remaining native forests, or 3% of the native forest remaining today. This is a view flying over Lanai. The native forest that you can see is not spread out the way it is on, say, Oahu or Kauai, but it is very constricted to the high elevation of Lanai Hale. So I'll probably refer to the Hale quite a bit. And I refer to this high mountain ridge, and all of that light green is what is sort of that's the uluhe that characterizes the remaining native forest. So I'm going to talk about what we know about the Oahu colony, our current monitoring and trends, some of our current and ongoing management, primarily predator control, a couple other Oahu conservation highlights, and then what we've found about other endangered seabirds and some of our landscape work. So obviously, just focusing here, most of what I'm going to talk about here is Oahu or Hawaiian Petrol. So like I said, folks throughout the early half of the 1900s reported some pretty small observations. The recovery plan gave like a brief shout out to Lanai, saying that they were found in the 70s, but the birds may be gone by now. Fern and Jay rediscovered the colony again in the early 2000s. And that's sort of where we picked up off of, was knowing that there were Hawaiian Petrol and there were probably in pretty high densities, but wanted to focus our efforts in looking across the top of the mountain, across the top of Lanai Hale, and try to better understand their distribution so we could protect them. So a lot of the slides I'm going to show and the maps are kind of zoomed in on this area of Lanai Hale. We use similar methods to Kauai, a lot of it largely done by Andre and his crew, of deploying song meters across the landscape. And what we found is this is a heat map of all of the locations surveyed. I think there was more than 120 locations, over 800 acres surveyed, and found pretty consistent Hawaiian Petrol activity across all of Lanai Hale, essentially, where there's remaining native habitat. And some of these areas are quite high activity with calls upwards of 40 something calls per minute. I will note this is what some of the area sounds like. And the average call rate here will be saying it's like 30 something calls per minute. This is TE3, which is right here. But that's what the AI is picking up. So my point here is just that this is like a cacophony, and all you hear is an underlying purr, which is probably similar to what Lindsay's hearing up at Mount Ka'ala. You can see how that might be a thing. All you sit up there and all you hear is this purr going on in the background. So distribution widespread across Lanai in very high densities. We also have a subset of those locations in the previous slide that we have designated as static units or static locations, where we are putting units in those locations year after year to look at long-term change over time. These are our static locations, but these are what they are right now. These are the locations that we've had out there since 2016. And so this is where I can show you what Andre also has seen on Kauai, where it's just a really nice increase in call rate over time with increasing management and protection of the colony. So zooming into the ground, across that same area, these are the known burrows we have found at this point. I think we're doing burrow checks right now, so numbers going up by the day. We're not doing directed burrow searching at this point, but we are still finding, we are finding burrows all over the place. And anytime we go into an area, we usually find more burrows. And I will note that all of those empty areas are not because there aren't burrows, but because we have not searched there. So we've found over 550 burrows at this point. And in talking with Andre and others, that's maybe 10 to 15% of the burrows that are out there, but it is hard to say. So on the ground, we do similar monitoring to the other islands, using cameras, checking inside the burrows. We've actually in the last year or two started using these burrow scopes that are wireless to your phone or iPad, so that you can take photos or video. They're pretty good, like 8 megapixel. And so that photo of the chick on the lower left is from one of the burrow scopes. So it's really helping our ability to confirm breeding and figure out a little bit better of what the birds are doing in there. We started out for the first, 2016 through 2019, monitoring every single burrow, but now that we are up into the 500 burrow area, we have not been able to maintain that level of effort with a reasonable staff load and given the other work that we're doing. So 2019, we worked with the San Diego Zoo through a grant from NIFWF to do a power analysis and optimization of our monitoring program, looking at our existing data, doing a regression analysis of where the variation is coming from in our data and in simulated data, and doing a power analysis of sample size that would be optimal to pick up the variation we want to see, we want to be able to detect across the Hale, but not necessarily monitor every single burrow. So now we are aiming sort of in this 160 burrow monitoring area. And what that looks like is, if this is all of the burrows across Lanai, we have areas that we have designated largely just based on geography and ridges. And within each of those areas, we have a panel of burrows, of 10 burrows that are monitored every single year. And the remaining burrows, usually at least another 10 to 30 burrows that are randomly selected each year. So what that looks like is, this was the 135 burrows we monitored in 2020. I will say that had we not been using this revised monitoring scheme, we would not have been able to probably get any good data from 2020. And this is what 2021 looks like. And I should say that for every single one of these burrows, they are monitored with a camera from the beginning of the year in early March, prior to the birds arriving, all the way through the end of the year. So we are capturing, not only focusing on burrows that are active, but we're capturing the variation of like some levels of inactivity, prospecting burrows where there are birds that are present but are not breeding. And we didn't have any burrow that we were monitoring where we were able to confirm breeding where we didn't know what happened. We always knew whether it failed or fledged. So that helps us refine our reproductive success estimates a little bit. And so this next slide is what you're not supposed to do, which is show reproductive success across using different monitoring methods, but that's the only thing we have at the moment. So this is, again, so there's an asterisk next to 2020, that it is a different monitoring regimen, but it generally shows a similar trend from what we've seen over the last couple of years of a just really stunningly great increase in reproductive success from around 20% of the burrows we were monitoring in 2016 to around 80% success now. And we have all of the concurrent graphs showing decreasing cat visits and decreasing rodent visits and decreasing predations related to this, which is all generally related to predator control. So again, like on other islands, Andres described the predator issues. We saw the same thing here. I will make a note that we do not have pigs or mongoose on Lanai. So our predators are limited to the mammals of cats and the several species of rodents. I believe that upper right rat looks like, I think, is a Norway rat. We had one getting into one area of the colony. We don't see them as often, but when they do get in, they cause a lot of problems. And again, in response to this, we incrementally increased predator control over Lanai over the last couple of years, concurrent again with that increase in reproductive success that we see. So this is, we are lucky here on Lanai to have a road going across the top of Lanai. It's a problem when it comes to invasive species introductions, but it is valuable for being able to access land. We still have the issue of cliffs, and many of those are not as steep as Kauai, but are dangerous enough that you cannot move around on them. So you might notice here that our rodent traps are following ridgelines and existing roads. And this has been a learning experience of we were implementing, again, we did not install all these 775 traps in 1 year. This was between 2017 and 2019, so over essentially 3 years. And we're still doing refinements based on where we see levels of depredation that are not what we would like. And one of the lessons here is that predator control is a lot less about the species you're trying to protect and a lot more about what the predator populations are doing. Someone else could put this out on their landscape, but this kind of alludes to Melissa's question earlier, but if their rodent densities and rodent movement are different, they may need more traps or wider distribution. Rodents are not too bad because they do tend to have a fairly small home range. So our traps are 50 meters apart on transects. Oh, I'm sorry, that's not correct. So the traps are about 50 meters apart, and in some areas 25 meters apart on transects that are about 100 meters apart. So 50 meters by 100, aiming for about 2 traps per hectare. And the only reason we're able to run all of these is because we're using the automatic lure pumps that mean that we only need to visit these traps twice a year. We've found great success with the traps that are laced with citric acid, which helps with slug and other kind of non-target invertebrate loss of the lure. And then looking at cat control. So this was also not all implemented at the same time. Those traps up along the Hale and the Minoa Trail were there first, and then some of those lower trap lines were added later. This is the road to our base yard, and so, you know, it's a dirt road, and we're like, we might as well trap along it anyway since we're there. And you might notice these are traps that are around the wastewater treatment plant where there are Hawaiian stilt and Hawaiian coot nesting. One of the notes I want to make here is these are our captures over the last couple of years. In the last year, I don't think we've caught any cats between maybe along this whole area of the top of Lanai Hale. We catch a lot here coming up Hi'i. The reason why these lines look a little funny is they're following roads, but also cats follow roads. So one of the big things we've learned is when we added these lower trap lines, again, thinking about them as a kind of a grid of, you know, that's approximately 1 kilometer off of Lanai Hale. Those are close to Lanai City. They're not trapping in the middle of the petrol colony, but we catch more cats down there, and we see a concurrent decrease in the number of cats on cameras at Hawaiian Petrol burrows on Lanai Hale. So you do not always have to trap in the colony. If you can catch a cat before it makes it there, that is legitimate. And that's actually probably preferred because hasn't eaten its way through half the colony before it made it to your trap. Here again, we still have had to work on efficiencies. Those are all live traps. And so we have started using a mesh network cell camera network that is monitoring the trap so that we can do daily checks without having to physically visit every trap every day. So what it just means is that we have hub cameras that can talk to at least, I think it's up to 25 other cameras that are not on cell plans. And so we get emails daily from each hub camera that sends us photos of all of the traps that, or all of the other cameras on that trap line. And so we can check them and see, like down here in the lower right, if there is not a cat in it or if there is a cat in it. Here's another one from a side view. Again, I will say here that this allows us to respond not just to cats, but to any bycatch of Hawaiian Petrol. There are some tricks and some subtlety and some detail that has to be attended to in order to do it safely if you're not physically visiting all of the traps every day. So we've developed some of that. And even with this large trapping network, we still will go in with leg hold traps or different, if it's in the colony, we'll use visual lure or auditory lures if there are cats that are not going into the traps, because we also have cameras out on the trails and roads to just detect cats that have entered the colony areas but have not yet shown up at a burrow or at a trap, and it allows us to do a little bit more rapid response. So moving on to just a couple other conservation highlights, again, working in partnership with Andre. You might recognize those little solar GPS data loggers. We did put out 30 tags here in 2018 and 2019 and got tracks back that, many of them mirror what you see on Kauai for Hawaiian Petrol. Interestingly, our petrol from Lanai go south for a lot of their short trips, and when you look at their flyways over land, they tend to exit the island going south over Manele. And when they return to the island, there's one little guy, which I would imagine is representative of a subset of the birds that like to come in along the north side, but most of them actually circle around the east side of Maui below Kaho'olawe and then come into Lanai from the south. But many of them, they hit the island from the south and then kind of follow the coastline and then come up the canyons on the east side. Which is great because there's no infrastructure other than, there's no infrastructure. There's people, camping and fishing over there, but just dirt roads and no large buildings. So this was also to help us as a landowner think about where there may be conflicts, where we need to particularly think about potential overlap, and especially, obviously lighting is an issue everywhere, but thinking about where are the hot spots, and then potentially moving that into thinking about where might there be hotspots with power lines. Again, we have way fewer power lines than other islands, but there are some. It's a whole other talk that Andre can give another time, but there has been one confirmed power line strike right in this area on the power lines that are headed down to Manele. So obviously makes sense given the amount of bird traffic over that area. And when there are downed birds, we have permits. So we're not under a regulatory HCP. We have recovery permits for our monitoring and predator control. And then we also have training and are covered under the Hawaii Wildlife Center's permits as a sub-permittee and as a location, as a stabilization center. We have a dedicated room for bird care. We don't take in very many birds a year. I think it's like less than 15 birds total of any species. So fallout is not nearly the issue that it is on Kauai. It's orders of magnitude off, but we would like to keep it that way. And that little guy up in the middle was actually an in situ rehab of a Hawaiian Petrol chick last year during COVID, of course, who one of its parents had been killed by a barn owl, and it was in an extremely accessible location for us near the bottom of the leeward side of the mountain. So we could actually get up to that little guy and give it supplemental food. And with the help and advice of lots of advice from a Hawaii Wildlife Center and from Pacific Rim Conservation, we were able to get that little guy fledged. So moving on, for this is sort of the third highlight area is that there is a predator-proof fence under construction here. Thanks to Lindsay for giving all of the background, so I don't have to. The large map there is the orange is an existing 1,800 acre ungulate fence around part of Lanai upper watershed. And the blue is the predator-proof fence line. So you can see in that left-hand lower left is sort of a zoomed in with the known Hawaiian Petrol burrows in the area. So you can see it's going to encompass a couple ridges. It is expected completion in early 2022. We were hoping to have it done by now, but COVID threw a wrench in things. And as you can see, some of those fence line sections go through active nesting habitat, and there's nests on either side of the fence line. And so the contractors can only work in those areas during the off season, which is pretty much the middle of December to the middle of March. So it's a very short and very rainy season. And obviously last year, it just, the construction didn't go fast enough. So hopefully they'll be able to finish it up by next spring. There are 130 known burrows in that area, but there's likely more than 500 burrows. If you look at that lower line, there's a lot of burrows along the fence line, but that's because we surveyed the heck out of the edge of the fence line. And those other areas with the open uluhe, we just haven't looked. And so if they're anything close to the density of the birds that we sort of found on both sides of where the fence is going, there is a lot of birds in there. And this area, so again, this is 80 acres. What's nice about this is it's going to be in kind of a middle area between those really small 3 to 6 acre sites and those really large sites on Kauai. So this is going to be somewhere in the middle. And it is going to be for us a focal area for habitat restoration. So I haven't talked about that, but I will more in a second. But a lot of that area in that fence currently is non-native habitat. It's strawberry guava and manuka and eucalyptus at the bottom. But there are also endangered plants in there like the Lanai pepe, and there's the potential for outplanting endangered plants. We have quite a few island endemics, and this is will be one of our higher elevation fences that'll be both ungulate free and rodent free. So there's a lot of potential there, for restoration. And this is what it looks like right now. So it's working great. This fence, or the photo at the top, was taken yesterday. So the fence is making its way down through the petrol colony. And then, you can't quite see it, but down there in the lower section, this is a photo from the bottom from a couple months ago. So it's not showing the fence snaking its way down the hill. But this is the photo on the lower right is from the road across the Palawai Basin from an LA road. And so it's starting to be quite visible coming down the hill. And just for your perspective, the fence is going to run along the top of the Monroe Trail, and it's going to come down this ridge over here. This is the main Hi'i Ridge. So it's going to be, again, 80 acres of some pretty nice habitat. So just closing out about what we know about other endangered seabirds and landscape efforts, all of those units across Lanai that we put out, that I showed you for the Hawaiian Petrol mapping, were also analyzed for A'o and Akeake. So for A'o, there were calls detected in 2 of the 4 years that we were analyzing all of these units. They were pretty much just single calls, so it is not indicative of any kind of nesting activity, though there are people who live here who said they historically, when they were growing up, or 10 years ago, heard calls that they said were more frequent. So it is possible and likely that they were nesting here at some point. I will put it out there that I've talked to some folks that if, again, subject to all of the caveats that Lindsay and Andre talked about in terms of needing to have a healthy source population or needing to have adequate passover rates to social attract, or having a healthy population to translocate from, there is the potential for social attraction or translocation into that Hi'i predator-proof fence. if it were something that the regulatory agencies and recovery folks wanted to talk about. And then for Ake, this is somewhat more exciting to me, at least. So those, again, analyzed all of the units for Ake. The 4 crosses were single calls that were detected in 2018 on those units. So in 2019, Andre's team helped, they put units further down canyon and picked up repeated calling at 4 locations, starting here at Atlanta 104 through 107. And some of it was pretty high call rates of like upwards of 5 calls a night at that lowest, or I'm sorry, 5 calls per hour at the lowest, farthest down canyon site. Again, indicating that there was potential breeding activity. So this is what it looks like. It's quite lovely. In 2020, Andre and one of his staff came over and did in-person surveys. They found repeated calling. They said it was pretty much constant calling. Birds were active across the canyon. There was ground calling and indicating there's likely breeding, but they were, again, the birds are far enough down the slope that it's not safe to try to access them. So this year, we realized that the highest call rate was at the farthest out song meter we put. And so we said, hey, these were those single calls in 2018. These are the call rates average in 2019. And so we've just last week put out 7 more song meters, a couple to repeat to be able to compare more easily from those highest call rate locations and to go further down canyon to see if we can pick up the core and the lower extent of their activity here in Hau'ula Canyon. This is looking down canyon from those lower song meters that we just deployed. I'm intrigued by the sort of those striations and structure on the walls of the canyon. You don't see that a little bit further up, and I'm wondering whether that might, I'm curious whether that might provide better crevices for some of them. And so I'm tentatively, I'm hopeful that we may find even more down canyon than we thought there were. So this is looking on the rim of the canyon. Again, I will just put out here that Andre and I have been talking, and this is relatively flat and potentially fenceable up to maybe 6 to 10 acres. So there's the potential for a predator-proof fence and social attraction site for storm petrels here, as well as being a mid-elevation dry forest habitat restoration site in the future. So just to close up, a lot of what many of us and have been thinking about it for the last number of years is stemming the bleeding. And over here on Lanai, since I got here and John and I started working here, it's a lot of our work and focus has been on stabilizing individual species and really small fences, but we are trying to think more about landscape, especially given that here on Lanai, the birds are so limited in habitat, and that, like Andre noted, we can do all the predator control in the world, and in the short term, that's great, but in the long term, we'll still lose the colony to strawberry guava and other invasive species. So this is a watershed conservation project that, again, is a whole talk in and of itself, but recognizing how much damage has been done and that damage threatens not only the native forest, but the nearshore reefs. Pulama Lanai has entered into a partnership with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to focus on 20,000 acres of that highlighted area across the eastern side of Lanai. I bring this up because the focal resources in that are the Hawaiian Petrol and the nearshore reefs coming from NIFWIF's interest in seabirds and coral reef resiliency. And we reckon it started out as it's going to be a 5-year partnership and grant program, but obviously this is a longer term commitment to conservation on this side. And what it's going to look like is reducing ungulates across that landscape, installing large scale fences to restrict movement of ungulates across that landscape, and to try to help reduce the loss of the native forest and the loss of the reefs. So there's a lot of work that has kind of, even some of it went on with COVID. The one thing that I'll highlight is this is a very preliminary graph from Lucas Fortini of, or not graph, a figure of vegetation classification. And he's going to be able to look at change over time. They have imagery from 2002 and 2018 to look at the change over that 18-year period in invasive species and native species cover. and help us prioritize where on the Hale specifically we need to be thinking about for habitat protection and restoration for the native seabirds, as well as the other species that rely on them. So this year we're moving into implementation of fence construction, starting with community deer removal and as well as documentation. So thank you to the many, many organizations who have given us advice and help and field work and data analysis. And thanks to all of you from Lanai's native species to the ESRC and the state and federal agencies for everything you do to help them here on Lanai.
Thank you, Rachel. I'll kick it off with a question. So I'm just curious, with being, you in a way you have a simplified management structure, decision structure on Lanai due to just the way your organization is. And so an action such as rat eradication at the island scale would benefit a lot of species that you work on. I know that you're already effectively trying to do that for cats with the program that you've got. You're still allowing cats on the island, but you're trying to make sure they're not on the landscape. And you don't have mongoose. So kind of the next biggest mammal thing would be a rat eradication. I'm just curious about your thoughts on the efficacy of that and potential gains for not only seabirds, but multiple species.
I will say that for cats, we're still in a control and management situation. Like when you zoom in and look at the area where our cat control is existing, it's still a pretty small portion of the island. And while I would love to, I used to want to think that there weren't cats the rest of the landscape. Like you can go 8 miles out to the coast on the north side and you're seeing scraggly cats walking along the coastline. Out in the CGMA, like the state helps to manage 5 miles from anywhere there's no water. I don't even know what they're eating. It's probably like cockroaches or something. So, but that being said, cats and rodents are definitely something that we have interest, because I do think that Lanai at 18 or 80,000 acres it's the way we've heard it described. It's large enough to be significant, but it's small enough to be manageable. Like it's not going to be a pilot, but it is something that could happen. I think thinking about it, folks like Island Conservation have thought about it sequentially, where again, you need to think about which species you're trying to remove in which order. Cats, it might be possible to remove with sort of physical trapping intoxicant methods. I think for rodents, given all 3 species that we have, like we have Pacific and Black and Norway, I think in order to do it effectively, you might need to get into things like gene drive. But I do think it would be interesting for us and possible if the tools were there.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I know that's less relevant for your immediate management goals, but I like to keep the conversation on the table. So thank you so much.
Please, thanks.
Are there any other questions for Rachel? If not, we are scheduled currently for a half-an-hour break before we have additional talks from Maui and Hawaii Island. So we will see you guys all back here at 12:30. And thank you, Rachel, very much for your talk.
Thank you for inviting me.